I wrote down everything I know and put it into a book. It's called Two Hands. It's free to download in digital form from my website, which is www.mc2.com.au. It's not a profound scientific piece or an academic piece. It's essentially laying out a framework. So if you are interested in thinking about some of the big pictures and where bits might fall into each other, I think of it as a primer. Okay, so that's where I am. We would normally go around the room, but since there's nobody actually in the room, we'll skip that bit of it. Thanks for that. All right, let's talk about the coronavirus. As I said, this is both health and economics. We're focused very much on the health at the minute, but the economics for someone like me is very important because this is ultimately a funded scheme of community services, of human services. So if the money isn't there, it's very difficult to do things. There was famously a nun that ran one of the big hospitals in WA who, when arguing about budgets, simply said to people, you know, with no money there's no mission. And I think that's true. That's the environment we're in. So what's going to happen? We know the situation is big, we know it's fluid, we know there's lots of unknowns. And I think when I'm thinking about this, particularly around the NDIS, I needed to think about a framework in which I could put things in. I can't get to an answer yet, but I can begin to put ideas and things that I'm observing into a framework. And that framework thinks about the broad markets, about what's happening with different supply and demand, so what's happening to the suppliers out there. Obviously, there's going to be some restructuring around how the suppliers work. And there's about capacity and costs. All these things are moving. There's what the NDIS is doing through the NDIA, and what's happening indeed, what the impact will be into SDA and SDA funding. And just to give you a hint in that, I've got no idea. There's nothing really coming through in that space yet. I think it will over time, but it hasn't begun to evolve yet. So what I'm talking about is this idea of having a framework where you just jot notes down and come back to it as things happen, and then come back to it and think about it later on. And I think you want to talk about three timeframes. The first time frame is the immediate, just getting through this. The next one is the medium term, so 3, 6, 9, 12 months. And the third one is the long term. And the good news is you don't have to worry about the long term because it's impossible to predict where it is. So this is very much about thinking of two time frames, the immediate and the medium term. And then I actually have this list that I jot down what the likely impacts are, what the responses have been by various players, what the new reality I think will look like, and what the challenges are and what the opportunities will be. And make no mistake, there will be opportunities emerging out of this time. In times of disruption, there is always opportunities. So as I said, that's just a framework I have on my desk, and I just jot down things as they come through. In about 3 months' time, I'll probably be ready to do the seminar about what this all means and what the opportunities really are. It's worth just unpacking the first measures that have come out of the agency, the National Disability Insurance Agencies. And the first thing that we see there is a commitment around planning for the participants. So moving to online and email, even though that was a bit fraught at the beginning, you can see the necessity for it now. So we understand what the limitations of that process is. But we're also seeing this capacity to roll plans over. So sort of lock things in place. This is sort of the hibernation approach, if you like. We also see that there's moving to support the providers in the space. So increased money and different provisions around that. So more flexible in how the payment is working. I haven't really been talking to people out in the field, but I imagine if you're paid for people to turn up and they don't turn up, that doesn't, an increase of funding doesn't help you that much. So I think these are measures will have to be adjusted. The other thing in thinking about this space is that the NDIS is now a very big federal program, and all federal programs will be cut, I would have thought, in the medium and long term, simply to pay for to accommodate a reduced economy, high levels of unemployment, less government income. So what we'll begin to see, I think, is people beginning to look for money. And I think the NDIA, or the NDIS itself, is pretty exposed because it is actually currently underspending and is not fully rolled out. It's not yet a mature scheme. So this is going to be a very interesting space going forward. Okay, let's think about some of the more fundamentals. Just to take a step back and go back to the real basics when we think about people with disabilities. And I think it's very important we actually identify which people with disabilities we're talking about, because we often use this as a shorthand. This is what we say in terms of, when we think about people with disabilities, we think about people with disabilities who are getting disability services, but in fact that's a very small proportion. So nationally it's about 4 million people with disabilities in the country. We've got a population I think about 25 million, so that's almost 20%. Now of those, only 1.7 are under 65, so most people with disabilities are older and they have an age-related disability. Of those 1.7 million, only about 815,000 will receive disability support pensions. Now Bruce is haranguing me from the audience, so he's got that under control. Good. Okay, sorry for that interruption. The wonders of modern technology. So of these groups, we've got 815,000 on getting disability support pension. So already you see, of the 4 million, only 815,000 get a subsidy related to their disability. Now, interesting enough, I am a person with a disability, so I'm hearing impaired, but I don't get a disability support pension, I get services, so I'm in that bigger gap. But when we talk about people with disabilities, you don't tend to think about me in that group. Then we look around the NDIS, and of the 815,000 people getting subsidies around disability support pension, 500,000 will be in the NDIS. Of those, we know that about 28,000 will be in SDA, and of that 28,000, about 17 or 18,000 of that will be the existing supply. So we're seeing this very small number. So of the 4 million people with disabilities in the country, 10,000 will be getting new SDA. So just be very specific when you're talking about people with disabilities. Are you talking about people with disabilities who are NDIS participants? Are they the ones getting SDA? I think it is worth unpacking a bit just some of the numbers. It's quite easy to forget how big the NDIS is. So let's just go back to some of the basics. That we're going from 330,000 to maybe 500,000 people. That's increased a bit. The spend is projected to go from 12 billion, this is what we used to spend on people with disabilities nationally, to 22.
Stop for a minute.
Yep.
We've got people having problems with feet. Just say we've got tech problems here.
We've got a few tech problems, so we'll just stop it for a minute.
Okay. Can you send them that URL?
It's streaming on mobile devices.
Okay, it's working on mine, so I'm not sure why it's not working for them.
Maybe get them to try another browser if the browser's...
Do they need plugins like?
No.
Shouldn't do, no.
Hi, welcome back, or welcome if you struggled to get through to us. Sorry about that. We're just having a few technical issues in this new modern world. On behalf of Lynn and Bruce and I, welcome to this session. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for putting up with all this changing and chopping that's going on. We're just adapting to the new environment, and like everybody else, we struggle sometimes. Okay, but today we're going to be talking about the NDIS and SDA. And just before I start, there's a couple of things. I just wanted to pay acknowledgement to country, to our Indigenous people in the country and their leaders, past and present. And also just wanted to explain that we are in sort of a weird setup in a way that we've got some people, most people online, but we have some people in another room here. And that's down to me. I have a wife at home who's coming out of a traffic accident, so I am at another level of isolation. I'll try to reduce my contact, as you would imagine. All right, let's get into it. There is the first thing, of course, some things don't change. Even in the middle of traumatic events or historic events like this, we have the lawyer's disclaimer indicating that this is general advice rather than specific. Moving on today, what I want to do is talk to you about the really big picture, both the NDIS, I'll talk a little about the coronavirus, and something about the housing landscape itself, narrowing right down to talk about the specifics of SDA and individual SDA projects. There will be an opportunity for question and answer. I might just pause for a minute and just check that this new stream is working all right. Yes, we're tracking okay, good. All right, let's talk into it. We've gone through an introduction. As I said, we talked about the, what I'm going to be talking about is the big picture and then the SDA. Just to talk about myself, I've been working around this space for about 35 years. I have run housing associations, disability advocacy organisations. For the last 10 or 12 years, I've worked for myself and my company MC2. About 2 years ago, I sat down and thought the NDIS was interesting, devoted 6 months to figure it all out, and I'm still going. So this is a very complex space. Even people like me that have the absolute luxury of devoting a large amount of time to it don't fully understand how it is, and to have an overlay of like what's going on at the minute makes it even more complex. One of the things I did do a couple of years ago was to take everything I knew around NDIS and on housing, or more broadly housing people with disabilities, and put them into a book which can be downloaded free from my website. So it's called Two Hands. It's just trying to give you a framework if you want to think about some of the bigger picture things. And I think in these times it's really good to understand what the environment is, what are the key elements of it, particularly when they start moving. So you can download that from free from my website, MC2 Proprietary Limited. I'm sure if you search you can find find that. Okay, so normally at this part of the session, we've done other sessions like this. Bruce and I have been to Perth and Darwin. We would run around the room and talk about what people want out of the day. Obviously, this is a conversation today is a bit one way, so I will think about the diversity of people we have in the room and try and cover that. But just if you have an issue or something you don't think has been covered enough, take a note, because we do have the Q&A session coming up at the end of this session. All right, let's move on. I did want to spend a bit of time just talking about the coronavirus because it is significant both in health terms, and that's the bit we're focusing on at the minute, but also the economic consequences will be profound, I think. It is fluid and it is unknown, and the NDIS operates in this market-based funded space, which is quite unusual. It's also new, which means it's not embedded down. So I think it will have quite profound effects on the coronavirus and economic stimulus essentially, and the recovery from that will have a profound effect on how the NDIS works. I'm not sure how, and in thinking about that, I realised what I needed was some sort of way to capture what's going on. The first thing I did was think about and define 3 different time frames. One is the immediate, what's happening today and what I can see, what I think is going to happen in the medium term, what's going to happen in the long term. And the good news is you don't have to worry about the long term because nobody can actually predict that. So we only need to focus around 2 time frames. And what I'm suggesting, or what I'm doing, is actually just noting things down in these different time frames. And when I think about those things I'm looking for, I'm thinking about what are the likely impacts, what is the response going to come from the different players, whether it's the the broader markets, you know, in terms of the suppliers, the demanders, the suppliers, those people seeking things, will that change? Probably will. What is the capacity of people? What do things cost? All these things are moving at the minute. What will happen in the NDIS in terms of its funding, and what impact this will have around SDA. Now, I think it will have some impact, but I've really got no idea what it will be. That's the thing I'm sort of interested in tracking, see where I get hints about that. So I think about what the likely impacts are, what the responses are, what the new reality will look like. You can predict that after a few months, and what the challenges are and what the opportunities will be. And just remember, there is always opportunities generated by an event like this. It's sometimes difficult to understand and sometimes takes time. So I just urge you to think about creating just somewhere a space just to record your thoughts or your observations about what the players are doing in various spaces, what's happening, what people are asking about. There will be shifts, and then the hard thing to do is to understand whether those shifts are just as a temporary one or whether it will in fact become the new reality. In terms of the agency itself, how it's responding, it's changed and provided much more leniency to participants, allowing them to move to phone and email reviews of plans, which is very sensible. But of course, we know that when the initial planning was done over the phone, that didn't actually work out so well. I would expect, however, if somebody's got a plan in place, they're in a much better place. They're already into the system. It's just about adjusting it, not trying to create a space within the new NDIS system. So I'd be very optimistic that would be working a lot better. It'll also allow these plans to be rolled over essentially for a year, 365 automatically. So it's taking, in some ways, some of the uncertainty out of this for people, which is incredibly important because we know that people with disabilities can be very uncertain and very anxious, as we all are in these times. And in terms of providers, it has made an upfront statement. The agency has made an upfront statement. It understands that this will impact on providers, and I'm sure it will. They've increased payments to the providers, and they're adding some flexibility around things like cancellation rules and adding more functions in around support coordination. So I think what you'll begin to see is the start of a conversation. This is not the final result, but watch that very closely. And I think you really need to be talking to people who are actually in this space. If you're not a provider yourself, talk to a provider about how what these things are meaning, what is happening to them. So there's no answers in this space. It's just a way of collecting all that information that's going to come to you over the next days, weeks and months. So you begin to form a view about where the opportunities are. Okay, back to the really basics. Let's think about people with disabilities. So we know there's about 4 million people with disabilities in this country, but most of them are over 65. So when we talk about people with disabilities, we often use it as a shorthand for people with getting disability services, NDIS participants. But in fact, the numbers are quite different. So of the 4 million people with disabilities in the country, about 1.7 are under 65. So most people are over 65, and we tend to think of them as having age-related disabilities, and for somehow that's different, but in the true sense it's not. I'm making these distinctions because I think it's very important you be precise in your language when you're talking about people with disabilities. Are you talking about people with disabilities generally, or are you talking about a particular age range or those in receipt of particular services? So for example, we know about 815,000 will receive disability support. So that means only half of the people under 65 with a disability are actually getting a income related supplement around disability. So I'm actually in that proportion that doesn't get a subsidy. So I have a hearing impairment, but of course I don't get disability support pension. I work and everything else, and nor do I get a disability-specific service. So thinking about that relationship, we've got the 850,000 getting disability support pension, DSP, about 500,000, so 50 or 60% will be in the NDIS. Most people in the NDIS will get DSP. I know some won't, but most will because of their low employment rate. And then of those, only 28,000 will get SDA, and we know that the number's going to grow to 28,000, with 17,000 now or 18,000 now. So there's 10,000 new places. So in the scheme of the 4 million people with disability in the country, 10,000 will get new SDA spaces. So this is why we're talking about different groups, different cohorts. Okay, let's talk about the scheme itself, because it's sort of easy to forget how big and ugly it is. Just rolling this thing out. It is well, up until a month ago, it was the biggest social reform happening in the English-speaking world. I assume it still is, but that's where we are. So we were talking about 330,000 people with getting disability services before this, and now there's 500,000. And that's about 1 million people in this country involved in it when you think about families and providers and everybody else. This is a huge movement. So if you don't quite understand it, that's okay, because it's almost impossible to understand. We know the spend is projected to go from 12 million, what we used to spend, the state and the Commonwealth, to 12 billion to 25 billion. We had a charitable history and government provision history of how we used to provide services. I came to the not-for-profit sector, and that's essentially where it was. And now we're moving into this commercial response as a market-based. We had a time when government and NGOs dominated provision, and now we're seeing government exit and the private sector coming in at much larger scale than it was before. We're seeing, it used to be that we operate on regional catchments. So when I was running a NGO, we would make a bid and we'd be in sort of against a couple of other providers, and there'd be 3 local government areas we'd be competing with. Now we're in a national market. Anybody can operate in any space. We know that during this change, that one of the things that happened is that we had all this infrastructure managed, all the processes of administration of the disability services were framed within government. So we had all these people with expertise sitting in within government. Now with governments backing out of this space, state governments in particular and territory governments are shutting down their disability services, all those people are leaving, and that's leaving a huge gap in corporate knowledge. So while many things will be new in the NDIS world, many things are known. We're just dislocating our corporate knowledge. So we're losing knowledge in a way. We know that we're moving from a time when we used to have allocated funds from the government, so you'd get a package and you get to spend it. Now it's much more that you can move and individuals can actually choose, and so providers now are in this marketing space competing for clients and customers, which we've never seen before, of course. And of course, we're bringing in mental health. We've always maintained mental health as a separate stream. It has quite different traditions and histories and operating practices and even basic ethos. It's a recovery model where what I call big disability is tend to be permanent long-term. But we're bringing that in, so that in itself is quite significant. In terms of social policy, if you did one of these things, that would be a radical reform. But to bundle all these things together is absolutely extraordinary, which is why it struggles a bit at times. I was interested to see what happened when the private market, when provision is opened up to the private market. And you'll see a chart, that blue chart at the bottom of this diagram. And this goes from, sorry, my eyesight's not that good, goes from 1971 to 2013. And shows what happens in the UK in aged care. So the blue bit at the bottom is the private sector. The others are the non-government. The orange is the non-government, and the dark orange, the lighter orange and the grey is the 2 government streams. So essentially what you see over this period is the original scheme, similar to Victoria, was a balance between government and non-government with a small private sector provision. But with the growth and the opening up of the scheme, we see this massive expansion in the private sector. We see the retreat of government and a modest growth in the non-government sector, which is sort of interesting. Obviously the non-government sector did not compete particularly effectively in the aged care market. Now, every market that was in the UK over that period of time, and that is a period of some 40 years. So it's a long period, but you see the trend. The other thing that's interesting is you see those ups and downs as happens over a long period of public policy change like this. One of the charts I don't have, which would be very interesting, is to what happened in, say, childcare in Australia. Excuse me. In part because there was a big private provider that was dominant in the space, who then wandered off and shut down their services, and their services were sold to a not-for-profit provider. So we sort of saw that balance change over time, and so not every transition will be like this, but this does give us some hints about what's going to go on, and particularly thinking about this long time frame. Where is it going to end up? Okay. it's worth just thinking about, sorry, I just need to get my throat. Just thinking about where we're up to. We said we're heading off to accommodate 500,000 people in the NDIS. We're now up to about 338,000. That was year to date. That's December 2019. We've committed, so we've got 338,000. The interesting thing is the increase in active participants. You'll see that the scheme is ramping up, which is what we would expect. And we're moving towards a point where we were committing that $22 billion. It's a bit unclear to me about exactly what the dollar numbers are, but it might seem 17, 18,000. We do have this underutilisation where people are not using all of their packages yet. So they have an entitlement, but they're not using it. And that's because they haven't requested the services don't exist, or the providers don't exist. All of this you would expect in the rollout of a scheme like this as it begins to mature. So we're probably where we would expect to be. It's worth thinking about the environment, about why it is why it is a bit sort of up and down, a bit bumpy. People will often say to me, "Where's the form? How do I fill it in?" And it's sort of hard to explain that, well, it's not clear what the form's going to be, or the form might be this, or the form might change. It is very fluid. This is a very, very ambitious thing. So it's understandably, it will hit impediments, and we saw them as it went through. Now, I've got to say, I think it's actually settling down now, but it's been quite a few years when you think about it. And in this space, I think what happens is the urgent will often overwhelm the important. I always think housing is important, but if the agency can't pay its providers, that is urgent, because we risk not having provision of services at all. I think housing is beginning to come onto the agenda, not only for the SDA space, but also for the 94% of people who won't qualify for the SDA. So this is thinking about that 500,000 people that get the NDIS and only 28,000 get the SDA. So this housing, I think, is beginning to come up for all sorts of compelling reasons. There's also changes around some of the policy areas. There's a couple in particular. One is around choice of provider, how you can actually choose a provider, a different provider in this space, and a separation of the housing and support provider. Things we've been struggling with as a service system for about 30 years, really. So we have seen a commitment built into the NDIS to actually pursue both of those objectives. How far we get is really unclear at the minute, and how far we're going to get is also unclear in my mind. There is also other pressures, apart from the obvious. We've got the Royal Commission into Aged Care, which of course has been had been generating significant focus on young people in residential aged care, or young people in nursing homes, YPINH. There's the Royal Commission into Disability Services, which is the Royal Commission into Disability Services, which is still going on as we speak. And there's various SDA reviews and reforms going on that have been committed to, that are beginning to roll out, and I'll unpack that a bit more. But what you see is this space that is moving in all sorts of moving parts, if you like. And it may be trying once again go back to think about a framework. How do I deal with all this? What is going on? What's happening to people? So I think about the NDIS as moving through a number of phases. We had the status quo, which is where people would get block funded and you deliver a whole bunch of services, and people would turn up to your services and they would get the place as it was available. We then had this aspirational phase where people believed, like people like me, that drank the Kool-Aid. We believe in this new idea, this new way of consumer-driven and consumer choice and real empowerment of people with disabilities. And in some ways that was about believing what was possible. I think we're going to move into, and we are moving into, this pragmatic phase. So we've got to get this thing to work. It's big, it's ugly, we're struggling. So we do things to get things to happen. And we've seen a bit of that as we've seen things like changes in design guides and the SDA. Things are becoming much more tangible, much more real. And I think ultimately where we get to is a rules-based system, because the I in the NDIS, of course, refers to insurance. This is ultimately an insurance company and insurance practice. So that's the journey we're on. It's a bit unclear where we are at different times, but that's the trend that I expect to see. I was trying to think about what it's like to go through levels of change, and I came across this stuff from Gartner. the hype cycle, was talking about new technology, and this is about things like mobile phones and things. And this diagram really struck a chord. It talked about what happened when a technological trigger, so in that case a mobile phone, in our case the NDIS happens. It talks about this peak of inflated expectation. Yep, it was going to solve everything and would do everything for everyone. And then the reality hits, and you slide down into this trough of disillusionment. I love this because of the language as much as anything else. But that would describe the week after I got my first smartphone, not being able to do anything. And then you climb up this slope of enlightenment as you eventually figure out how things work and systems are built and eventually it works. And then you're onto the plateau of productivity. I think one of the things that's important is that we're all at different stages, and you can slide up and down this depending on the day a bit. But hopefully you're on the plateau of productivity, or at least climbing up the slope of enlightenment. But if you're like me and you travel around, you talk to people, some will be still overly enthusiastic about the NDIS and some will be overly despairing of it. So it really, you've got to think about who you're talking to, where they are, and place them on them, and recognise this is a journey people are on. So people are going to do this in different ways and different speeds. Just be aware of that. Okay, I think it's worth talking about the landscape. We do have some data about the people who get disability services, and once again I'm sort of narrowing it down to those people. And there was about, this data refers to about 240,000 stuff. This data is 2015-16, comes from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. The reason I'm using data that old is because as the people migrate into the NDIS, we're actually losing cohorts. We're not actually maintaining data. We're not collecting data in the same way. So this is the last sort of clean snapshot. The other thing is this space around housing people with disabilities is actually not that fluid. Not much changes too quickly. So this is quite indicative. And I was interested to look at some of the different states. So you think about things like, do people live alone? And we see in New South Wales about 7% of people who are getting disability services live alone. In South Australia it's about 18%. And that's about a different history of disability service provision. Strangely enough, the total indicates that 23% of people live alone. That's not actually a mistake. The way these statistics are framed, it includes a whole bunch of people getting employment services, and then they're not listed by state, they're listed nationally. So what you will see is that these people will tend to much more likely live alone than not. Okay, so if it looks strange, don't worry about it. I think in some ways the best comparison is looking at particular states. The same is true when we look at things, do they live with families? So once again, New South Wales 76%, Victoria 66%, Queensland 69, so the three big states. South Australia a bit less, 59, and Tasmania 70. So as you move around the different states, there's different traditions. It becomes a bit more stark later on, but there's different expectations. The statistic I haven't included in this, which is probably the most different, is WA, because that has quite a different history of disability services, and those people are much more likely to be living alone or with families than with others. Now let's just move on to another statistic, just about whether people live in private residence or other than residence. So once again, it varies. So we see New South Wales and Victoria. New South Wales 81%, Victoria, well 80%, Victoria 70%. So you see quite a big difference. 10% is a big difference in these areas, although the expectation is people will live in private residences. And those that live in other than private residences will be large. So in Victoria you see this 31% figure where people are living in other than private residence. We'll unpack that at the minute, but largely that's our group houses. And in South Australia you see 23%, for example. Of course, the one thing, this records those that live in Aboriginal communities, and those numbers are particularly significant in WA and Northern Territory, but much less so in the other states. You look at that number in Queensland, 0.4%, New South Wales 0.8%. These numbers are very small. It doesn't mean they're not important, not complex, but in relative numbers they're quite small. I was trying to think about where people lived in terms of the group homes, and they, because this is a statistical piece, they tend to use this definition around domestic scale supported living facilities. It's very snappy. But what we see in New South Wales is 46% of people in New South Wales living in group homes, and 51% in Victoria. So they're similar. Queensland 30%, and that's because the next category, supported accommodation facility, which tends to be the larger facility, the hostels, if you like, those living in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bedroom places. So what you see is a different history and a different demographic in New South Wales, particularly in Queensland. New South Wales, Victoria are similar. So if you're having conversations across the border, they'll have a different set of expectations, if you like. And one of the things you see in Victoria is there's quite a high proportion of people living in independent living units in retirement villages. I don't really understand what that is. That's not something I've particularly been aware of, but that's what the statistics are saying. And then a large proportion living in public place and temporary shelters. One of the things about these statistics is on a per head, Victoria was delivering services to more people than per capita than any other state. So it might be that they're delivering a disability services to people who are homeless and then beginning to count them in this sort of process. So once again, the problem with these statistics is once you begin to unpack them, they just get more and more complicated. In terms of housing, it's just worth thinking about what stops people with disabilities getting a house or maintaining a house. And this is, in some ways, the guts of what I'm going to be talking about. And I think the first one is around supply. You can only actually access stuff that is there. It sounds really dumb, but it's not just about supply, but an expectation. So when I'm talking to a person with disability and their family about a particular housing model, 3 units or an apartment in a high rise, if they can't see anybody who's living in one of those with a disability, it doesn't make sense to them. And if they can see somebody, but there's a 5-year waiting list, it really doesn't matter. So the first one is supply. Second one is housing management. These are not in a particular order, but my point would be if any of these barriers manifest, they can actually stop you. They can stop you accessing the housing, or they can stop you maintaining the housing. You need housing management that is responsive. I used to manage 1,000 tenants with disabilities, and it worked very well, but I had a housing management structure which was similar to a real estate agent's, but probably had 3 times the staffing because of the complexities we were dealing with. You need adequate and responsive support. That almost goes without saying. Housing is like the tail on the kangaroo. It helps you stand up, but without the rest of the kangaroo, it really doesn't work. So you've got to have those 2 things working together. The property itself has got to be well located and has to be appropriately specialised. And this then goes to the discussion later on around specifications. Cost. We know that people with disabilities predominantly are poor. They have low employment status. Their families tend to have less assets. So they will struggle in things like the private rental market. So I tend to think, in fact, strangely, this is the biggest barrier. It's actually cost, not the accessibility. It might be information. They may simply not know how to navigate these systems. As an expert working in this space, I struggle to navigate these systems, so that is entirely understandable. Or they may not be able to manage the transition process. We've all heard stories of the new house, the child moving out of home, and on the last day, the parents saying, no, we don't want them to go. And that's a terrible outcome. And that says to me, we haven't done the transition with the individual, or in this case, the families, whether it's building their skills or their acceptance or their confidence. So we've got to cover off all of these things, but only where they're needed. Very few people will face all of these barriers. We have a couple. People typically face 1 or 2 of these barriers. So what you do is you deal with the barrier that is in front of you, not the perceived every possible barrier. So I'm essentially arguing why you don't need generic disability housing. You need to figure out what the barrier is and respond to that for the person with disability. In thinking of the broader housing market, now I am coming and sort of narrowing a bit down towards SDA, but let's think about it. I think we have 4 quadrants. We have the rental market, and that includes private rental and social and affordable housing rental, so the public and community housing rental that's out there. We have home ownership, which is people owning their own home, which is highly unusual, or it may be that more commonly they're living in the family home, which is owned by their family. There's also a bunch of people in transition, and this might include those people in residential aged care, and we've We know there's great work being done around the young people in nursing homes, getting them out. There's people in rough sleeping. There's people who are homeless, who may be in transitional accommodation or crisis accommodation. There are people that may be in short-term accommodation or medium-term accommodation. Medium-term accommodation seems to emerge pretty over the last probably 2 months. I've heard a little bit about it, not sure I understand what it is, but I sort of understand where it sits. It's a path, it's on that journey to getting the permanent accommodation. And there may be various programs. So people might be living, for example, in an independent living skill development program for a few months. So think about that as transition. So what I'm sort of saying to you is that there is different spaces and people end up in different quadrants. In terms of the supported accommodation, we know that about new and existing SDA. We've talked a little bit about that and I'll unpack that much more. But there are also the emergence of this thing called SIL houses, where people are bringing together people on SIL to create new houses. No subsidy embedded in the housing, for the housing in that arrangement, but what there is enough support dollars to make it worthwhile for a provider to do the effort, put the work in to actually create the house. And there's also some traditional, what I call non-SDA. So in Victoria, they're called Supported Residential Services, SRSs. They have different names in different states, and they might include, for example, boarding houses. So once again, creating a quadrant to help you understand where people with disabilities might live. Now, this might look a bit confronting, but it actually makes a lot of sense if you overlay it onto a community. If you take this into your community, you can actually point to where people with disabilities are living, but more importantly, you can point to who the service providers are in each of these and how people might get into them. I talked a bit before about what's happened with the differences between the different states, and there's been this journey that's been going on for people with disabilities in housing. I was going to say for 30 years, but that would be wrong. It's probably for 50 or 60 years as we've moved away from closing institutions. So I think what we've seen, particularly in terms of housing and support, how these two things were brought together. And I think we're on this journey that goes from a combination of the two, where you have housing and support embedded together. We then moved to a phase where we had a more integrated approach, but we would, okay, thank you. Just getting some feedback. I'm being too enthusiastic. I'll try and slow it down. We were moving from this phase where at the beginning where we just totally combined housing and support, never thought about them much at all, and that was largely around the institutional approach, if you like. We bring them together. We then began to integrate them, so maybe have separate functions. Somebody collects the rent, somebody provides support, but they're embedded in the same organisation. There was a period and you couldn't actually choose. And in some ways, what we then moved to in this new era of the NDIS, we, for the first time, are really seeing at scale things of both collective choice and individual choice. As we give people the opportunity to choose a service, if they're in a service like a support service which requires them to share, they obviously can't make an individual choice, but they may be able to make a collective choice. We're seeing this in some group houses where people are actually getting together and every 6 or 12 months deciding on who the support provider should be. And finally, in some ways, the ultimate in this process, in this world, we hope for, is people can individually choose where their service are coming from and who's going to provide them what that service is like. We're obviously not there, but once again, it's this idea of this journey we're on in terms of service development. And to unpack that a bit more in looking at specific housing models, what we see is a move from the institutions, which largely are closed in Victoria, and we begin to see close in the other states, where we had 20 or more people living together. So we had some people living in large institutions, and this doesn't happen in a state or territory on one day. It doesn't happen in exactly this order, but this is sort of the trend you see over time. You see the institutions close. We then saw the emergence of hostels, where larger people, so 9 to 19 people might come together in what we used to call a hostel. So that was sort of the next evolution. So not 200 people living on one site, but 7 to 9. We then saw the emergence of bigger group houses, what I'm called the legacy group houses. So they could be 6 to 8. There was a particular period in development in Victoria where they were developed for older people with disabilities. And finally, well not finally, but the next big phase was typically what happened. We moved from the institutions and we moved to group homes, and then we move into this idea of the cluster housing. So not everybody under the one roof, but maybe a number of people with disabilities and only people with disabilities on one site. And then it might be network housing where people might live by themselves. As this transition happened, the relationship between support and housing changed. So we see in institutions it was totally integrated, one organisation. That was true of small institutions. We saw it with most group houses, but there was a movement 20 or 30 years ago where we began to see the separation of housing and support even in the group homes, which was complex but was a pioneering work that's happening to where we are today. With cluster housing, that separation happens much more likely. So we might see two separate organisations managing the housing and support. And that's sort of the natural state. Once you move into network housing, it is totally divorced. The housing and the support are totally divorced from each other. Thinking about the housing and the non-SDA, I want to come back and just re-emphasise that point about how small SDA is in the bigger NDIS landscape. It's not small in terms of money. The people living in SDA will consume a significant amount of the NDIS budget, but it is small in numbers of people. So in a housing sense, it is small. So this is an illustration that we have about when we're at full, when everybody's enrolled, we will have about 94% living in non-SDA. We'll have about 3.5% living in existing SDA, and 2.5% living in the new SDA. And of course, that those numbers between the new and existing will change as the existing stock gets redeveloped. But just be aware, if you're in the room and people are talking about housing for NDIS, you know, of the 100 people in the room, only 6 will qualify for it. I wanted to unpack a bit about what the demand is. And if you're doing any sort of business planning, it's sensible to know who the customers are and where they are. And this is really complex. I mean, I think we're pretty clear about what the demand is for SDA because in some ways that's mandated. We know it's going to go from 17 to 28,000, so there's 10,000 places. We don't know much, we don't have as much information about where that demand is and what it looks like, but we've got that absolute number. The bit that is unknown in the broader housing debate is we think about 90,000 people outside of the SDA will be looking for housing. Now, where they end up is really unclear because they can't, you know, they're unlikely to be able to afford private rental. They probably won't, they'll get on the queue for social housing, may not get there, they won't be able to afford private ownership. So you're going to have a lot of people looking for housing and few of them will be able to get into the SDA. There has been suggestions that the SDA demand is in fact much higher than the 28,000. Summer Foundation did some very good work with SGS Economics, but I think that 28,000 will become a hard cap. And from a funding sense, I understand that, but that does have this problem in that it becomes incredibly desirable to get into the 28,000. If you're the 28,001 person, you're missing out on quite a lot by not getting into 28,000. So I think there'll be a lot of focus on getting into it. The other 94% I think will impact greatly on the social housing sector, the community and public housing providers. So we'll begin to get them engaged in this space much more than they have been to date. There is some demand work, some maps produced by the NDIS. They don't help that much with SDA, but they give you some absolute numbers. So I was interested, one of the problems with looking at these maps is you have to define what the market is, and it's really unclear what the markets are because it may, you know, in a suburb people may want to travel from different places, they may have historical connections, there may be, excuse me, historical distortions because of where the institutions were placed, for example. So what you see is that this is a good place to start, but it's very much just a place to start. So, one of the things I did was just unpack it for a city in Victoria called Mildura, which many of you will know, because it's quite isolated. So that Mildura is the market, it's going to be itself and it's going to draw from the neighbouring areas pretty much. But it gives you some sense of the growth. So as I said, it doesn't refer to SDA, but it does refer to the number of participants. So in Mildura, the number will go from about 300 to about 1,400. That is staggering. That's a huge increase. And this is showing that the growth of the NDIS is not consistent across the country. It will increase much more in some areas than others. In our most affluent suburbs, in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, the growth might be 5 or 10%. But you go to regional Victoria or remote areas, for example, and it'll be a factor of growing by 5 or 6, times, not percent, times. So it is uneven. The numbers around mental health in Mildura, we're estimated to go from 41 to 50 now to between 77 and 251. And that's just giving you some indication of how imprecise this data is. To actually go from those numbers is extraordinary. So, even our best estimates are not that good. The money will go from 5.3 million to 44 million. This is the total NDIS spend. Now, if you're in Mildura and you're thinking about disability services and you're in local government or something, you're probably not thinking much about it because it spends the same amount every year, might go up by a couple of 100,000 employees, provides a few jobs. It's sort of a bit interesting, but once that figure goes from 5 to 40 or 60 million, that changes the ballgame entirely. So this means that if people with their economic development hat may suddenly get interested in the NDIS, because it does represent economic development, and critically in this time it actually represents jobs. And we see that the growth in shared support accommodation will grow from 9 to 24 million in this space. So in a place like Mildura, the NDIS is going to be profound. New players, new products, new services, all sorts of things. It's very important. It's happening over an incredibly short period of time, and we're not quite sure exactly how it will play out. So if you are looking for that data that says there's going to be 4 people looking for this sort of SDA in this sort of space, it's just not going to be there. I think the only real solution is actually have line of sight. You've actually got to somehow engage with those people with disabilities, and particularly those people wanting SDA in the community you wish to serve, the community being the marketplace you wish to serve. So you've got to think about mechanisms to engage with people rather than just looking at the data. The other thing that's happening across the country is because it's a national scheme, it's bringing together a whole bunch of different themes from different places. And of course we have this very different history in WA, in some ways much more innovative, much more individualised. And there's a program over there called Individual Living Options, which I think is really interesting because it's about the non-SDA. It's that cohort that sits just below the SDA. And what's interesting about that is that it's about how people with disabilities can be supported to actually live in the private rental market. Now that's a great challenge and great opportunity because that's the one area where we do actually have supply. SDA is there and growing, is small, but and social housing really has no access at all. But in the private rental market, there are mechanisms that's beginning to evolve. This is a work in progress. We've seen some early work come out of the department, out of the agency. They're working their way through it, but I think this will have a profound impact, in part because it will sit hard up against SDA, so it will interact with it. Now, where are we up to in time? I know my voice is struggling. We're at 9:30. I might, sorry, just to, does it matter when we have the break or?
No, we can do some Q&A if you want.
Yeah, look, what about we stop it now? Do we have a mechanism to do Q&A now?
Yeah.
I've been flying through this, and I'll happily just stop it there, and I'll just happy to answer questions, and Bruce will yell the questions out as they come through, or someone.
We were going to set it up in the break, you said. But you can just go out.
Will slides be available after the stream? Yes.
Yes, they will. So will slides be available? Yes, they will. Sorry, this is a bit messy, I know, but it's just, okay.
Last minute organisation.
Yeah. So if you've got some questions, so Bruce, how do they?
That's okay. They just type them into the chat screen.
So just type them into the chat screen, and I'm happy to unpack them a bit. If there's things you're curious about. Okay. We might have a morning tea break now, and if just during that time, if you want to chat through your questions, and we'll come back. Sorry we're not particularly organised with this. We're doing a bit on the fly, but we'll get there.
It was short notice when we moved past.
Okay, so we'll have a break for
15 minutes.
15 minutes, starting now. Okay, I'll be back in 15 minutes to answer some of your questions about the big picture, and then we'll move on to the SDA. Thank you. Hi, welcome back. Thanks for that break. As you can see, we're still juggling with the way we do things, so we're moving through it at a pace. We thought it'd be a really good opportunity just to sit down and take a few questions. So Bruce has now got the mic and he's going to start asking the hard questions brought in from the chat room. Bruce.
Interested to know more on how, as a developer, we can meet some of this demand that isn't being serviced by SDA.
That bit you're talking about, of course, is the 94%, which is incredibly diverse. But the sort of things that I'm seeing outside the SDA, which are really interesting, is things like the SIL the SIL houses, where they're bringing together a number of people with disabilities who have fairly high support packages, and possibly hundreds of $1,000s a year, and are in fact creating housing around them. Other things that are going on, which I think are really interesting, are these mixed developments where, if say a regional rural area, you might build 5 units and 2 might be SDA, 1 might be a SIL house, 1 might be owned or sold off to a family, for example, 1 might be sold off to somewhere else. So using the SDA in some ways like the cream on the cake, if you like, to spice up the package. The problem we have in terms of property or housing for people with disabilities generally in the private rental market is they are poor, they cannot afford particularly high levels of rent. So we need to somehow subsidise that or accept a lower level of rent. That said, I have heard some of the build-to-rent people talking about a model that they've been using, which is generating enough return. Now, I haven't unpacked it, but it does strike me in this time of very low-cost money, it might be that we can get some of these developments to work. So, in short, the answer is you've got to be very broad and just think about who it is and what capacity they can pay, whether it's capital or recurrent, what other players might be involved. It might be the support provider might want to be involved, the local council might be wanting to be involved, the local church might want to be involved. It's those sort of complicated community deals that I think will really make an impact in this space.
Are there any examples of SIL-only houses operating in Victoria yet?
Yes, and I know nothing about them, unfortunately. They are popping up. I'm intrigued because in some ways they are housing people who are almost identical to those in SDA, and SDA is quite a regulated space, and the SIL space is potentially unregulated. I say potentially because they may in fact be covered under state legislation in Victoria with, as a supported residential service. But that's unclear. Look, it is just an emerging area. It makes sense to me that it will emerge, but I actually haven't seen who the players are, what they're doing, and whether it is sustainable or not, and how it will change. I think it will emerge into a sustainable area, but how, I'm not sure.
How do you see development of the private rental market working for this cohort, and what can architects, developers do better to facilitate?
The private rental market is really interesting. As I said, there's people working in the build to rent space. The ILO program out of WA, the Independent Living Options program, has been working in this space and has been doing things like funding a co-tenant in a rental space. So a person with disability moves into a 2-bedroom flat. The other flat is occupied by somebody who's on very low or reduced or low rental, and they essentially have a neighbourly interest in the person with disability. They're not a support provider, but they get a discounted rent, and suddenly you get these subsidy arrangements which overcomes that biggest barrier, the one I talked about, the cost barrier. And this model works really well. When I was working running housing, we had a development of 3 units. The 2 people with intellectual disability living in the 2 back units. The front unit was occupied by a student who was studying at one of the universities, studying social work, and that was a different student each year. But it just allowed somebody to be on site to sort out any problems that come up. But it also allowed the parents and the families who were very anxious about their kids moving out of home, as parents often are, rightly so, to know that there was somebody there that could sort of solve the problem before it started. So I think that in my mind, I see the ILO leading to many more programs like that. We haven't really seen it roll out, but I have great hope for that.
Interested to know more on how a developer can meet some of this demand that isn't being serviced by SDA.
I think you've really got to embed yourself in the community. And sorry, the previous question did ask about the role of developers and architects. I think we're now seeing a whole cohort of people looking for housing that could never look for housing before because they didn't have portable and adequate support. So the people with disabilities couldn't move out of home because there was no support. Now the support is available, they're beginning to look out. And so I think this only really works if you think about the community or the market, it's the same thing essentially, and just sit down with people and think about what is possible. Bring your expertise. I've always found housing both elegant and brutal. It's in this space. It's elegant because good housing can make people's lives better. It's brutal because you need the money to make it work. It's simple. Now, for people who navigate the world of disability services or simply have a member of their family or have a disability themselves, they're not particularly used to that sort of language. So I think developers and architects and others can perform a tremendous community service by bringing these together. It will generate work, but I've got to say to you, this is not the most lucrative work you'll ever do, but it's probably some of the best.
Are there finance providers familiar with SDA present, or is a list available? The usual lenders are hesitant as they have not heard about SDA and think it's too good to be true. Thus, they will not lend on the NDIS proposed rental return, but will only lend against the regular rental market data, or only as a commercial loan.
Yeah, two of the smaller banks that I've dealt with have certainly deeply invested in this space, and that's Bank Australia and Community Sector Bank, which is part of Bendigo Bank, and those guys are absolutely across it. I do understand there's limitations and there's nervousness. I think that nervousness will fade over time. That having come out of the finance industry, I got to say to you, these people are not risk takers. Bankers are very good at saying no, so they'll always be the last ones to come on board. What they do is they follow the big players. And now, while we have some money coming out of the big players now. We have money coming out of the super funds, for example, into SDA. But the biggest mover and shaker in the space one of the biggest I see is Macquarie Bank. And if you follow Macquarie Bank, you know where they are, there's money. So I think other banks will follow other banks. I think it will happen over time. But if I was trying to get a project financed, I'd be starting at one of the two I mentioned, Bank Australia or Bendigo Community Sector Bank. And I find those guys really good. Even if they say no, they'll be very clear about why they say no. It will educate you about what bankers are ready to lend on.
I have 2 children having high support needs. I'm planning to build a home for both with their specific needs in mind. I guess the webinar will cover this scenario. Probably not down to the technical side of things, but that's something which we're either myself or Joseph are more than happy to have a chat about if you call it either of our offices. Next question is, following on from the finance provider question, are there novel approaches in this sector similar to the Nightingale housing model for affordable housing in action that you're aware of in this sector?
Yeah, and in fact, the disability sector pioneered mixed equity and shared equity going back some 30 years. I mean, Nightingale is a new version of that in a way, but there's been lots of innovation. And I've got to say, I ran some of those programs, and we had about 250 people with disabilities actually owning some of their housing. These programs are complicated. They rarely go to scale, it would be my sense. I think they are a part of the puzzle, but they're not a big part, partly because people with disabilities don't have money, but if they do have money, they tend to have enough, or their families tend to have enough to buy the unit. If I was trying to get home ownership happening in the disability sector, I would be making a product available that is robust, appropriate and affordable. And given the interest rates being what they are today, the difference of cost between equity and borrowings is pretty marginal anyway. I think the thing that a Nightingale can bring, and we see it in the common equity development of, in some ways, the first SDA housing development in Gibbs Street, is they're a developer that can actually create the product. So I'll talk a bit about that project later on, but what it does is they can build space for SDA and for non-SDA in their developments, if you like. They are more focused on these smaller, more difficult markets. If I'm a big scale developer, I'm probably not going to be looking at this space, but if I'm going to do a small development in a community, it'd be great to have the builders and developers in that Nightingale model at least aware of it and thinking about it.
That's all the questions we have to date. Now, we are getting a few technical type questions on the provision of SDA and how to build. These will all be addressed in the second session after lunch. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm big picture, Bruce is useful stuff. Okay, let's just move on to SDA. Now I'm going to go through this A to Z, not design obviously, but the key components. So, and I'm doing this, being very precise about this, and you'll have a copy of these slides, because it is a insurance scheme. It will run by rules. So rules become very important in this space. So the first thing is, what is SDA? SDA is obviously specialist disability accommodation, but I'll read it. People need to have significant functional impairment and or complex needs. So there's two components to that. They need specialist designed housing. There needs to be integrated housing and support, which is quite an interesting comment given we're talking about the separation of housing and support. It needs to be separate but integrated. It funds both existing and new. It is recurrent and commercially funded in an open regulated market. There's a lot of components to that, but you don't get a bunch of money in one place, you get it recurrently, and it's commercial, so it's commercial arrangements. It's an open market, but it's a regulated market. So we're in a complicated space. It replaces shared support accommodation. So if you talk to someone like me who's been working in public policy, we will talk about shared support accommodation, SSA, or more likely group homes. So group homes are SDA, were SSA. So if you hear that language, that's what that was. It is defined by complex rules and regulations. I mean, it's almost an understatement, but I think it's worth recognising that it's not just the most obvious ones coming out of the agency, it's going to be the other ones coming from states and different parts of government, for example, that will impact on SDA. Also, thinking about that eligibility for SDA, in the rules it says the need for SDA, the need for that sort of housing, is unchanged by technology, home modification or capacity building supports. So it says that as these other things improve or have an impact on the persons with need, their need or eligibility, for example, for SDA might fall away. Now, we actually haven't seen that happen much at all. I reckon that's a longer term thing, but I am, once again, I'm extremely hopeful around this world of technology that that's not going to improve it to a point where people don't need the sort of level of face-to-face assistance that we might be giving today, which might reduce some of their demands, for example. So I think that's a long-term trend, but very interesting. There's a whole bunch of resources out there. There's some, if you're really interested in the history of this or the framing of this, there was a decision paper that will actually outline it from a couple of years ago. That's the bedrock of it. And then there's various rules. There's the SDA rules, they get updated, so if you need to go have a look at them. There's operational guidelines, there's an SDA page, and all of these documents actually have a link to go to that document in the presentation when it comes out, so don't worry about chasing them too much. There are also a very few sets of very good resources of information, and one of them of course is Summer Foundation. Those of you that don't know it, they do a lot of work around young people in nursing homes, getting young people out of residential aged care. But what they have also done is spread their expertise across all of SDA and indeed all of housing. So they do very good work. They have practical guides and the more academic stuff that I'm interested in, for example. So I think they're a very good space. So that's the framework. I think in talking about how the SDA is rolling out, I think there is 3 streams you've got to get your head around. In the old days, when it was just fully integrated and you build a group house and people would move in, you'd have 2 streams. You'd have the people getting ready and the house to move in. But now we've created 3 streams, if you like, because we're separating off the housing and support. So in fact, we have the SIL component, the support component, which we're not talking anything about today. That is a complex area in itself. There is the properties, and for me, the key point is when the property gets enrolled. There's other stages it goes through, but the enrolment stage is where it becomes available. And then it's the participants, and it might be those participants that are already in the scheme. Of course, remembering there's 17,000 people already sitting in group houses today and another 10,000 coming. So it's about bringing those things together. So when I think about participants, for example, I'll think about new and existing. When I think about property, or the property component, the dwellings component, one of the things that is really confusing is that some of the data coming out of the agency talks about dwellings and some talks about places. And as we know, a dwelling can be from 1 to maybe 5 or 6 places, so they're not the same. You just got to be very careful looking at the numbers. Are they telling me how many new houses there are, how many people are accommodated, or indeed how many people are accommodated on one site? It's just got to be really careful unpacking this stuff. And the support providers are very important. The support component, the SIL component, and particularly that SIL component without SDA, because you can actually have SIL support without living in SDA. You can't have the reverse, but you can have it without living in SDA, and that becomes quite significant, because in some ways that's the same bunch of people living in different ways, or a similar bunch of people. As I say, harking back to the old days, it was pretty simple. Government would give money and we would build a house and people would move in. It would all work pretty well, or indeed government would sometimes build it and hand the house over to us. These days, moving into this open market approach, this recurrent funded approach, we have a whole bunch of different roles, and not that you need a different agency or different organisation in every role, but it is now possible to have lots of different players. And I think when you're having the conversations about how you develop SDA, you need to look around the table and see whether all these people are actually represented in some form or going to be represented. So, and in my head, I break it down into those involved in the development process. This is classic property development 101. You have the developer, designer, people doing the construction. You've got those people putting up the development equity. You've got the development lender, and you've got the project manager. Now that can often sit within a couple of organisations. But what I'm saying to you is, in the disability housing space, that role, or the interaction with those people, typically hasn't happened, because that's been done by government or has been block funded to NGOs who will simply employ a project manager who will take care of it. So this is about having new conversations and new language as you interact with different people. We then have this transition from the developer to the owner, where we have a sale process. This may or may not happen. We're seeing some people hold their properties in the long term. This is particularly true of the super funds, but other people are developing to sell on to the market. And I've got to say to you that I think the role, this is stating the obvious, but the role of the developer is quite, and the interest of the developer, different from the role and the interests of the owner. And the owner will have, of course, within their sphere, a deep engagement with the support providers, the SIL providers, but also with the support coordinators and the local area coordinators, because that's how people are going to come in and that's how they're going to find people. So that equation is getting more complicated. The owner might have their own lender. They might be a SDA provider in their own right. They may use a housing service to manage their stock, or they might have a property manager. Now, I had assumed that SDA providers would in fact be the property managers, but what I'm seeing is those roles are now beginning to split. So SDA provider is almost becoming a compliance function. And so what we're seeing in some projects is somebody might be the SDA manager, and I think this is true of the New South Wales government stock, that they in fact are the SDA provider, but in fact the ownership of, the management, the housing management of their stock is actually outsourced to community housing providers in partnership with the support providers. So this is much more dynamic than I thought it would be. I think we will see a consolidation around some areas. I think there was another housing program called NRAS, National Rental Affordability Scheme. And what we saw there is the top 8 providers probably controlled about 80% of the stock. We see this concentration simply because the cost of compliance is reduced the more you have it. So it makes this sense, and particularly if you can separate it off. What that means for me as an owner, it means I actually don't have to be an SDA provider. I can actually get somebody to do that function. I can still go in there and buy it, buy the property and own the property. I don't even have to manage it. I might be a very passive owner. So all of these options arise. What will become workable, what will become common is not yet clear, but it just is opening up all sorts of possibilities. as someone who's someone working with social, there was an American bank robber called Willie Sutton, and somebody asked Willie Sutton why he robbed banks, and he said, because that's where the money is. And I always think about that in this world of government policy and government rhetoric. I follow the money. That's the thing that shows me where the intent is. So if a government says it's going to change the world and it puts $100,000 into it, I think, oh, okay, that's PR. But I think if you really want to understand how something works, you ask this question, how do I get to the money? And so this is what I've done in terms of SDA. So I'm thinking about, you will be paid SDA when you are a registered provider. There is a registered provider. It is an enrolled dwelling. It meets design standards and other standards. There is a service agreement with the occupying participant with the right SDA and enough SIL. I'm going to unpack all of that, but that's they're the hurdles as I see them to get that dollar into the bank. So in that statement, the things I really need to unpack is about SDA payment, how much it is, what registering an SDA provider looks like, what the design categories are like, and Bruce is going to go into detail of these later on, of course, the enrolment of the SDA property itself, occupying participant with a service agreement, what does that mean? What's the right SDA category, location, type in the plan? Is there enough SIL? And how all these policies interact with things like density restrictions, choice of provider, and separation of housing and support. So this is what I'm going to work through now. This really gives you a framework to unpack all of this. So remembering this is a roadmap, not a how-to manual. I think the first thing that struck me when I looked at these numbers around the SDA subsidy was how high they were. I understand the logic behind it, but in terms of the amount of money that is paid to people, it's quite high. So if we look at this diagram, what we see is essentially two different cost structures broadly. One is the apartments have been paid much, much higher than what I'm doing here is comparing apartments, a villa and a group house of five bedrooms. So sorry, an apartment of one person with one person in it, a villa duplex with two people in it, and a group house of five. So the dark blue is the apartment, the grey is the villa, and the light blue is the group home. So what you see as you move across from left to right, we move from the lower design standards, which is the improved livability, through fully accessible, robust, into high physical. So the first thing is when you chart this cost, you see that the subsidy in apartments is much higher for apartments. Sorry, subsidy for apartments is much higher. And as you move across, as a building essentially gets more complex, you get a higher level of payment. But just the absolute payments, I think, are extraordinarily high. So this indicates with a high physical, with an OOA, which is, I always get that wrong, overnight accommodation.
On-site overnight assistance.
Overnight on-site overnight assistance. Yeah, okay, so that's an extra room, essentially for the staff. But what you see is you get a subsidy of 80-something thousand if somebody's living in a one-bedroom apartment, but at that high physical. But for that same person living in a group home, it might be 25,000. So radical difference, and that reflects the different cost structures of living in an apartment to group homes, but also the numbers that the efficiencies of a group home. If we think about where we are in the trends, one of the things that has intrigued me is, given that previous diagram, what we've seen is the development of models like summer housing, where they're using putting people with high physical needs into apartment buildings, and they are partnered with very clever financial people, so they're getting very good product, which is obviously tapping into that high level of cost. One of the things we know is there's been a very consistent budget around SDA. That the spend has always been talked about at 700 million, and the number has always been 28,000. That has stayed constant for the last 3 or 4 years, however long. And if you do that calculation, what you come out with is about $25,000 per head. That's where you've got to end up as an average. So when I see stuff coming through at $80,000, $100,000 per head, I'm thinking, well, where's the balancing part? It might be that, you know, for every place in a group house, in an apartment, you need a place in a group house. There is also another part of this, of course, is because that average picks up on where people are in existing properties, and the subsidies for existing properties is less than new. So the point I'm making is that as I see new stock roll out, I'm really interested to see what it is, particularly around the configuration, whether it's apartment or group homes. If it becomes too high a proportion of apartments, then it'll put pressure on that 700 million a year, which will begin to put all sorts of pressures on the system. And it's not as though it's 30 or 40,000, it just is much, much higher. So just, if you are interested in this space, look and see what happens. And if you begin to see some pushback around apartments, that's probably what it is. I suspect the market or demand for apartment living is naturally limited, so it may not be a case. We shall see. For completeness, and this is in your slides, I've taken just a leaf out of the rates that they're using for the SDA. This is the subsidy rates, and I've just highlighted the lowest level. This is for new only. As I said, existing will be less. But for new only, for a group home with 5 people, livability, no overnight accommodation, there's a subsidy of $13,418 a year. For a high physical 2-bedroom apartment with 1 resident, includes overnight accommodation, it's $110,000 a year. So you see this extraordinary diversity. The other thing that this shows is that this is not a simple one rate fits all. Because not only is it depends on whether there's an overnight accommodation or not, or whether it's which level of, which size of building, what type of building affects the price. All of these things affect the price. And then just to make it more complicated, there's an overlay that sits on top of it which adjusts it for geography. So somebody did calculate how many possible prices there were, and I think it was thousands. Helpfully, the agency does have a calculator online, and there's a reference to it later on. So the only way I can work things out is go in and plug in the numbers of that calculator and have a look at them. So there's a couple of things that it does provide allowances for. The first one is around this geography, this allowance for geography, and it is quite significant. It ranges from 0.83 to 2.53. So if the base rate we're talking about was 10,000, if you were in that particular spot, you might only get 8,300, or you might get 25,300. It varies, which makes it really complex to work out. Let me assure you, you've got to go back to that calculator and really start to drill down on where you are. When I've looked at the outliers, so where are people getting more than 25% more? It's in Sydney, as you would expect, basically all the Sydney suburbs. In the Northern Territory, in both Darwin and the Outback, for different reasons. Darwin traditionally has always been an expensive place because of demand and everything else. It's quite expensive housing, but the Outback, you can only imagine the complexity of building in some of the more remote communities, for example. And there's very little activity in those communities as we speak. In Melbourne, it's only the inner city of Melbourne, so the inner suburbs, and in Perth, the inner. And they're the only parts of the country which is around more than 25%. And also it gives you this hint about why the NDIS is focused on Sydney and Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. They're the big population centres, and they will drive lots of this policy. There's 17 catchments where it is less than 90%, so there's a 10% reduction. A lot in Queensland, in those areas that people would know much better than me, like Ipswich, Logan, Toowoomba, for example, the Sunshine Coast. Some in the Barossa Valley, and some in South Australia, some in Hobart and Tasmania. And that's really intriguing, because one of the things we've seen in Hobart over the last couple of years is a absolute shortage of accommodation that never used to exist there. So that's gone from one of the places that used to be the easiest place to get a rent. I think it's now the hardest place to find rental property now in the country. Now, I would imagine that would translate into house prices that may affect this down the track. So what you've got to understand is this geographic modifier will probably change over time as well as the markets change. And then in Victoria, it's essentially in our regional areas where things are cheaper: Shepparton, Mornington Peninsula, Gippsland, Warrnambool and the southwest. So there's a link there, that, as I said, that will go to the price guide. There's also allowances for fire systems, which Bruce covers off at length. So just be aware, the pricing is complex. I would say to you though, I reckon it is generous. The sort of project analysis that I see, not that I do much in it, but occasionally look at one, is showing very good returns, particularly when we're in an environment where the cost of money is coming down. If we apply these numbers and actually think about a place, for example, in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, I was trying to think about, excuse me, how much SDA subsidy, how much revenue would I get for an individual property? This is a classic financial. And so your revenue comes from two sources. There's the SDA subsidy and what's called a reasonable rental contribution, which was in some ways based on social housing, but is not quite the same. But the rule essentially is you can charge somebody 25% of disability support pension plus 100% of what they're entitled to under Commonwealth rent assistance. Crudely, that gives you about $9,600 a year, I hope. Yes. So you've got $10,000 per person per year out of that. But then once you factor in the other subsidies, depending on, of course, the configuration, the total income will increase, and depending on where you are, the numbers will increase. So, for example, and in this model, what I'm doing is looking at the income from the property, not the income of the individual. And what we see here, looking at the less modified houses on the left, the blue and the light blue and the green, for a group house might be generating income of 260,000 or a bit more, 270,000. And this is the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And that is in part because this geographic factor is coming into play. There might be an inflator or something that increases the subsidy by 1.5 or up to 2.2, might double the amount you would expect looking at the table. But it goes right across to a 5-bedroom group home for people with high physical needs with an overnight accommodation. It has an income there of 380,000, which is a staggering amount of money from a housing term. And if you're an accountant, you think, oh, well, this is dead easy. Let's do this. The problem is that doesn't represent good practice. That doesn't represent where we're going to go. Broadly, as a society, we've been moving away from group homes into much smaller accommodation settings. So what you're seeing is the pricing signals coming out of this from a purely financial position are driving towards particular places. In a market sense, because subsidies are only paid when they're occupied, there is this risk of oversupply, which is not carried by the agency. It's carried by the owners, essentially. So if you buy something or you build and own an SDA and it's not occupied, that's your problem. It's not the agency's problem. They only pay when it's occupied. So we have this real risk that people will chase the money, build it in the expensive or the high return areas, and then too many people will build there and oversupply a particular market. In terms of becoming a registered provider, there's a whole set of rules published around that. The things that I've made provided links to that, and they are what they are. People are navigating the provision system, the registration system pretty well. There is, of course, a compliance cost that now is beginning to kick in. So people need to be audited, and that has a cost, which makes me think we're going to have fewer and fewer registered SDA providers. And it's also really important to note that the owner does not need to be the registered provider. The other thing that's really clear is in the separation of housing and support, that is a separation of SDA provider and SIL provider, not SIL provider and SDA owner. So you, in fact, can be a support provider, own your own SDA and have somebody else manage it. That has complexities in it, but that is allowable under the scheme. As I said, we begin to see the rollout of the standards, and they are emerging now. The Commission is beginning to roll them out. We're beginning to see the audits. I haven't really been deeply involved, but my observation would be that the first couple of audits will be fairly gentle, and then particular areas will be focused on. And the areas that I'm particularly interested in are how ultimately how the Commission will view things like separation of housing and support and choice of provider, for example. I'm not sure how that will play out over time. Okay, and there's various information. I've given you links there that you can follow up at your leisure. As I said, there was an emergence of, I expect a consolidation in the numbers of providers, SDA providers, and we're beginning to see that already. The new, the minister proudly announced, when was it, a few months ago, that we were making great leaps in rolling out the NDIS because we had more SDA providers. I didn't find that a useful comment at all, I've got to say. I think that we're going to have a small number, well, we might have a large number of providers, but most of them will be relatively small. So what we've seen over the last 4 quarters, over last year, the numbers of active providers have gone from 731, went up to 800, back to 721, and this is because the compliance costs are beginning to kick in, and now they're heading down to 550. We've seen the numbers of active providers increasing, so 140, 166, 195, 215, so the trend is up. I suspect that trend will still going up, but what you will also see, I think, is this concentration into a small number of SDA providers at the top as people develop a specialist business around the space. The other thing the agency reports on is that, understandably, the vast majority of providers are organisations, not individuals. I'm not sure why an individual would want to be an SDA provider. I would simply outsource it to someone else. We talked about the design standards. I'm just working through the list, and I won't do that. Bruce is going to go into that in detail later on. The SDA categories, once again, it's those design standards. The enrolment property. So we now have this process where a property can get certified as. Now I'm struggling. It gets certified as pre-certified and then certified. Pre-certified is when the design works, then you get certified, then it gets enrolled. So in my head, that's the pipeline. I'm interested in that point where the stock becomes available. So that's about how it gets enrolled. And there's a mechanism there which has been clunky, but people are getting through it. So that seems to work pretty well. And that's around, details around building type, design, all those basic property things you would expect to have. Interesting enough, there's a whole bunch of properties which are referred to as legacy, typically state-owned, which don't meet the minimum standards but are the existing properties. So they will be essentially phased out of the system over time. And that's what will drive the redevelopment of the new stock as we move from that. So we've got 17,000 now, most of those are existing. As we move to 28, that number of existing will be more and we'll redevelop more than that 10,000. Okay, so the property has to be enrolled. You have to get the participant with the right SDA. So it's not enough to build the SDA for the high physical, have somebody that requires improved livability. You will be paid for improved livability, not high physical. So, once again, you've got to think about what the actual demand is. And given what I was saying about the demand picture before, there's not good data coming from the agency, this really does imply that you need to get a deep understanding of who in this community will be living requiring SDA, who might be looking for your property, because as though you can actually reserve your property for them, that's unlikely in most markets because there'll be other people building other properties at the same time. So you've got to think about pools and areas of demand to get the right mix of property. And that's not just about the design standard, but you've got to remember the plans are specifying where it's apartment, duplex or townhouses, houses or group houses, and location. So it is quite, while people do have choice, it's within a very prescriptive set of choice done by the planners who may not have the best information about housing available to them. And thinking about this point of line of sight, about how you get to people, and that's the thing, you've got to actually see the person that's actually going to live in the house. And we're seeing, I think the most helpful mechanisms I'm seeing are there's 2 particular sites now that are advertising vacancies. And they're a tremendous source of information. You get an idea of what's vacant, but also what's coming on stream and what it looks like. So I find it very valuable. One is Housing Hub, part of Summer Foundation. Both these sites are national and they're expanding from different bases. One Housing Hub's coming out of Melbourne, Nest is coming out of Sydney, but they're covering across the entire country. So what we see when I did this slide, Housing Hub had 100 115 properties in New South Wales and 192 in Victoria, for example. And in the same slide, so I'm just having to look at this, Nest had 238 properties. I suspect their vacancies, not properties, but you get the sense. So what you're beginning to see is this marketplace emerging. One of the things I've been intrigued is looking at regional areas of Victoria where there is existing government stock, and they have vacancies existing for quite a long time. And this is to do with the history of this housing. What happened is when we closed the institutions in regional parts of Victoria, we built this housing around it. Now, nobody actually particularly wants to live there anymore, so nobody's moving into it. So those houses are emptying out. And that eventually becomes a problem. It's a problem for the SDA provider because you're budgeting on having, you know, for a 5-bedroom house, 4 people or 5 people. But it's a much bigger problem for the SDA provider because for the SAL provider, for the support provider, because if they go from 5, at 5 they're probably making money, at 4 they're breaking even, at 3 they're losing a bomb. So if they got 3 people in a group house, this is a real problem. So as the SDA provider, as the SDA owner or the person carrying the risk, you would do far worse than align yourself with the interests of the support provider, because in some ways, if you're in a circumstance or facing a circumstance where you might lose $10, they're going to be losing 100. So it's quite a different magnitude. The other way that I would approach looking at finding who the people are is to actually go out to the community, because people with disabilities and people who will live in SDA don't live in isolation. They're quite integrated into a disability service system and their broader community. So what I've suggested is there's a whole bunch of people you could go out and talk to. I'd start obviously with the support providers, but there's other things like the social housing providers might have participants in their stock who might want to move out. There's people in private rental. There's people who've got non-SDA. So all of these, this is sort of going back to that diagram around the market, who all these different players are. So if I'm thinking about who they are, and I would think about the support providers, I'd think about where families of people with disabilities might come together. They might have networks. I would think about local government, for example, because they often have a deep interest in this space. So this is all about thinking when you build the project that people know about it, are aware of it, and you've got a clear line of sight about where the big bunch of people is that will come to be your first residents, but then your future tenants beyond that. So I think it's important to think about those sort of processes and a broad community engagement. The other thing that I've seen happening in some of the regional areas is people like the Rotary and the Lions clubs getting involved and having these whole of community projects to get an understanding about what is possible in a particular area. You've got to remember, building a housing for SDA is great for the people who've got SDA, but it represents economic development activities. It also represents jobs, and that might be quite significant in a regional rural area, for example. Having enough SIL, and as a housing provider, you only sort of know whether it's enough if it's not there. It's like you can only see it through the services that are being used by your tenant, thinking about the tenant and the recipient of the support provider. So, you know, this is really hard because in the old days what we used to do is have a partnership. As a housing provider, I would partner with a support provider and we would come to a guarantee. It would be a contract. But in a day and age where you can actually choose different providers, those relationships break down because there's no guarantee my tenant will have to pick that support provider. So that support provider is not going to guarantee for that tenant anymore. So this is becoming a lot more dynamic space, but it requires you really to have a deep understanding and a deep engagement, I think, with support providers, not one, multiple, and I think all of that within the context of people having choice of provider. I don't know how dominant practice will emerge. I know it will emerge, but I'm not sure how it will emerge over time. But a very interesting space. And there's a whole bunch of detail there about support provision, but my advice is just go and talk to somebody who's doing this day to day, because that's their business and it has a level of complexity which is even more complicated than SDA. And in all of these things, there's a quote, what's now called the SIO quoting process, which goes through this very complicated process, which is wonderfully encaptured in what looks like a very simple and streamlined diagram, which I can assure you it is not. So once again, this is one of those spaces where you've got to think about yourself as part of a value chain. You're working with other people who together you bring a product or a package to the marketplace, and you need them. You need to understand them and respect and tap into and respect their expertise and their requirements. One of the more interesting areas was this issue around the density restrictions. Bruce, do you cover this off? Or?
Yes.
All right, Bruce will cover that off. Excellent. Choice of provider. I have provided some language here because I'm really intrigued by it, because at the minute there is an absolute interdependence of housing and support, and there's very little choice of provider in SDA except in a collective choice happening every couple of years by some providers. But the language is interesting because that sort of underpins everything. That's where I expect it to go ultimately. It says, each participant's right to exercise choice and control over NDIS provision is not limited by their choice of SDA dwelling. So this is quite a clear statement, but I can't reconcile that with the support providers that might own their own SDA, or in fact the support providers who have a contract with the SAL providers, with the SDA providers. I'm not sure how that works. And it does contemplate where people are doing both. It says where the SDA provider is delivering both SDA and SAL to the same participant, there are separate service agreements. So you actually have separate service agreements. You might be the same organisation, and it's implying that you have separate structures within it. The other thing it then goes on to talk about is the NDIS participant's housing right, including security of tenure, are upheld irrespective of any decision around the provision of supports. So that means if I'm in a house owned by somebody, a support provider, and I say I don't want that support provider, they can't boot me out. Now, I'm just not quite sure how that actually plays out when the tenancy is provided on the condition that that support provider is continued in place. So once again, there's this conflict between the clear policy and the policy direction of the agency, where we are and where we're going to be. I suspect what happens, like all these things, is a set of practices will evolve over time which meet both the practical requirements and the aspirations of the scheme. Separation of housing and support. Well, it's just, sorry, it's that same slide. It's actually the same thing, so sorry. I wanted to talk to you about the growth projected in SDA, and these numbers I think are one of the most useful set. And that is this sense that we're going to go from 17,000, add 10,000 to 28,000, and through the process redevelop the 17,000. So looking at the individual numbers, and this comes from some work Summer Foundation did, as I said, very good work, with SDA. That bit of work was done with SGS Economics. And so it was saying that there will be, as well as the people existing in the scheme, people will be drawn from a number of areas. It might be young people in residential aged care. It might be those people living with ageing carers. It might be those people in short-term accommodation, and now we know medium-term accommodation might go into it. Or it might be those in or exiting child protection. So what we see is a bunch of people in there and other people coming in from different sources as the scheme begins to grow, as this part of the scheme begins to grow. And what we see is the growth rates in different states is quite different. So nationally we would see the number growing by 61%. But for example, if you look at the big states, New South Wales and Victoria, New South Wales grows by 57%, Vic by 69%. But you go somewhere like the ACT, that's growing by 124%. So the big states are growing by 50, 60%. The smaller states tend to be growing by more. So it's not clear. And of course, that growth is not consistent across the state. It will be impacted by a whole lot of various impacts by demand, historical provision, all sorts of things. But you see these different levels of growth and different numbers of growth. The really big numbers are going to be in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. And of course this assumes that the existing stock will be swung in as existing SDA. And there was some debate, I know, going on in Queensland around the 3,340 existing places. I'm talking about places, not dwellings here. That they actually wouldn't swing them in. They would actually want all new SDA built. I'm not quite sure where that debate's up to, but that would be really interesting. That would show a lot higher level of sort of construction development activity in Queensland than the other states, for example. So if we look at growth, what you see is this is just a chart representing those numbers, putting those numbers, and the blue is the existing and the yellow is the growth. So what you see is the three big states with the big numbers, and then the smaller states with significant numbers but not nearly as much as those big three. It's essentially following the population, if you like. On the other side, what you see is that this is a chart of how much existing stock is compared to what we anticipate. So in this, what we see is we have very limited growth in South Australia, and we're probably at 90-something% of what we expect to have. Whereas my apologies. This is the amount of active with SDA. Sorry, just scrap that comment. Too many slides. When I was talking before, I showed you that funnel about the emergence of what's happening. We've got the people and the properties and the support coming together. So looking at this, what we have in this diagram is we know that we're heading towards that 28,000. So where are we in those two streams of the property and the participants with SDA? So in December, we had about 13,000 people with SDA in their plan. So we had 3,000 more people with SDA in the plan than in fact we had registered SDA places, 10,300 places, of which 1,700 places were new. But that's not the complete picture, because when they report the places, they exclude in kind. So this is the stock owned by some of the state governments. So in fact, we're not sure what the figure would be, except to know that there's 17,000 places. So I suspect that middle figure should be about 7,000 places higher, and that will happen once the transition process finishes and those in-kind places from the state governments fall into it. The state governments, particularly in Victoria, is a very big owner of stock. It's got some 5,000 places, 1,000 dwellings out there. And of course, with any market, having somebody of that scale in there, it's critical to know what they're going to do. And we really don't know what they're going to do. We know the state government still owns it. They're still doing the SDA, but we don't know where it will end up. So it becomes quite significant. And then looking at the various states, the things I wanted to compare. So this is just comparing New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland about where people are up to. So in looking at that outline, that's where I expect the number of people to be in SDA when this is all done. So I had 9,000, whatever it is, total. Yeah, 9,000. We expect 9,000 people to be in SDA, or SDA places. Sorry, just let me check something. Yep. So we expect 9,000 people to be in places in in New South Wales. But today we have about 8,000 people with SIL. Now, if everybody in SDA was getting SIL and only people in SDA, that would be great. But in fact, what we're seeing is more people are getting SIL than getting SDA. So it shows we are moving towards the people having enough people having support to move into the place. We've seen that we've got about 4,900 people with SDA in their plan, which is probably a better indicator. So we're in New South Wales, of the 9,000, we're well over halfway of getting people with SDA in their plan, and that's happening every quarter. And New South Wales is more advanced than any other state in this process. It is moving people much more quickly into the process than other states like Victoria, as you'll see there. And in fact, Queensland has been quite slow in getting the numbers. Queensland has got a very high proportion of people in SAL, but the SDA, of course, is slow coming through in terms of both getting people in their plan, but also more importantly, we've got to have the enrolled properties. So these things have got to converge at some point. So it just gives you a sense of where we are. I was intrigued about what was being enrolled, and we see on the blue figure here, what we see is, as you would expect, mostly the activity to date has been enrolling existing stock. We haven't seen much new stock coming through, and in fact, we don't just talk about existing and new. There's two other types. There's legacy stock. This is big stock that won't fit into, will never qualify and gets a short-term life, a 5 or 10 year life. In Victoria, this is some 100 and something dwellings, which surprised me it was that many, I must admit. I assume that these will be adapted or reused or repurposed as something else. But the big numbers is at this part of the scheme, we're just enrolling the existing stock, and we've got some new ones coming through. And we expect a lot of new stuff to come through, but it hasn't yet. The grey indicates the activity in the last quarter. So this is up until December. And what we see for the first time is the number of places being enrolled in the new is exceeding the existing. So we're at that crossover point where most of the activity is now enrolling the new stock. And there is a provision for refurbishment, but what we're seeing is nobody's refurbishing anything. And there are fairly obvious reasons for that. It doesn't work. I was intrigued about size because there's always been this debate around group homes and how big they are and everything. And so what we're seeing is a change in the size. So today, on average, we have 3 people living in individual dwellings, which is still pretty large. And that represents not just every dwelling being 3-person, but a whole bunch of group homes with 5 people in it, then a whole bunch of smaller stock. So it's sort of spread over a spectrum. This is really an average, but a misleading average in a way. There's sort of 2 cohorts, if you like. And what we're seeing is, which doesn't surprise me, is on the right side, the average number is now declining. So we're at the smaller number of dwellings, or smaller number of bedrooms in dwellings. We're also seeing the size of the new dwellings looking remarkably consistent, looking at about 2. So it says to me, on average, we've got 2-bedroom stock coming through, but that, because I know there's a bunch of 1-bedrooms, I expect there's a balance of 1, 2 and 3. If I could see the diagram, that's what I would expect to see. And that's probably what I would think. So we'll move from an average to 3, probably to 2.5 over time. But it shows a move, not necessarily everybody's building 1s or everybody's building 5. So it's probably where we need to be. There's a lot of debate around group homes, and that's a very contentious area, but it's just worth getting some sense of terms here, just so we're using the same terms. And I break it up into 3 different cohorts. I think about, and this is really basic stuff, but you've got to get the basics right. So individually, I think if a person lives by an individual, that's an individual. If they share with one or 2 other, I call that shared housing. This is consistent with the agency's definitions. And if they live with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I call that group. So it's worth thinking about just those 3 cohorts. So the difference in a policy sense between somebody sharing with 1 and 2 other people is not that significant. Sharing between 2 and 4 others is significant. So just use that as a way to think about these conversations. There was a debate that group homes are representative of the broader community, and in fact there are larger housing where 5 people might live live in a single dwelling. I was intrigued by this, so what I did was just plot the distribution of housing, which is the white squares, if you like, versus the distribution of stock we have amongst disability accommodation today. And what you see today is the largest cohort of people, this is the solid blue, will live in 5-bedroom group homes. Almost 35% of people will actually live in 5-bedroom group homes, and and another 10% will live in 6+, another 15, 25. So you're looking at about 60% of people now live in group homes. But if you look at that white dot, it's very unusual for the broader community to live in with 4 other people. There are some, but it becomes less and less. And what we see at the other end of the spectrum is that a little over 5% of people might live by themselves, whereas in the broader community we know we are now a nation of sole individuals or couples, so 25% live. So people with disabilities are living in quite different aggregations, different numbers to everybody else in the community, and we expect that to change over time. Our aspiration is that people with disabilities live and participate in the community the same way as everywhere else, and so that follows in terms of housing. So I expect that trend to move to become more like that. So less group homes, but more individual accommodation. There is a whole debate going on around group homes, which I won't go into. They provide an illusion of efficiency. There's this really interesting bits of research that says that the same person in the group home living outside the group home will actually need less services, cost less. And it's really funny because you naturally aggregate to gain efficiencies. But this is one of those areas where it doesn't actually work. And that's for a couple of reasons. It's because if you're running a group home, you tend to lift to the minimum, the requirement of the person with the least capacity. So you bring the capacity up to the service to meet the person with the highest level of need, not the lowest. And then once you do that, you build dependency. As it would explain to me, if you had somebody move into your home and then they provided a service to do the dishes, would you continue to do the dishes? No, you wouldn't. So you'd learn this dependency. And so there's this whole debate going on around group homes, which has been going on for 20 years, I suppose, and you'll see it pop up over various times. There's some of the arguments for and against it there. In terms of coordination with SIL, this is that thing about separate but integrated and collaborative. And I think about the three-legged stool, that you can't have one with the other. I'm searching for a good analogy with this, whether it's a tail on the dog or whatever it is. But these things really need to go together. So my key message here is around a partnership of some sort, bearing in mind I've been respectful of that policy of separation of housing and support. And so also recognising that the support component might spread beyond just the SDA and move into non-SDA, for example. Okay, let me just, look at that. So I'm just thinking where we are. I'm wondering whether we should have a break for questions or comments.
I've got a few now.
All right, so I might just take a break there, if that's all right, and we'll just go to a few questions.
If a not-for-profit rents a house in the private sector in order to accommodate a group of friends, e.g. 4, is the not-for-profit who is renting the facility on behalf of the group of participants bound to install sprinklers or have smoke detectors wired to the fire panel?
I'll defer to my building expert.
Okay, we'll save that one for the second half. One thing I haven't understood, will SDA funding cease once 27,000 places achieved, i.e. current 17,000 plus 10,000 coming? No,
it continues for the life of the property, and there was big debates around how long the funding would, at current rates, would continue. And it's now reviewed regularly, and the period of that review is extended, and I've forgotten what it is, 5 or 10 years, but essentially, this is a 20-year funding mechanism. So, if I'm doing strategic planning, these prices will move over time, but I expect it to be in place for 20 years. I don't think that you've got it, then there's a significant risk that something else will happen. Practically though, if government has a requirement for this housing, it would be very difficult for it to unravel it at 20 years unless some other scheme is put in place. The other thing about housing is it generates support efficiencies. So for every dollar we spend in housing, we spend in this space, we spend 10 in support. So what looks like quite an expensive spend in housing can actually be saving you money on the other side. So if you're sitting up running the scheme, you're the NDIS, it makes sense for you to invest in housing, even though it looks a bit expensive.
For the high physical supports, I read somewhere that payments are only for 5 years through SDA. Is that correct?
I'm going from memory now, but I'm pretty sure it's reviewed at 5 years, and I think the expectation is 20. The banks and then the big institutional investors pushed back on that. It was saying you couldn't actually finance something with a 5-year commitment, and they went away happy. So I don't understand the detail, but I think it's for much more than that. But that will be outlined in the SDA payment document, the pricing document that I've made reference to.
Does SDA need to be constructed to be enrolled or simply certified? Actually, I'll answer that one in the second half. Have you seen examples of best practice in matching participants' compatibility for group homes?
Yeah, this is a really interesting area. I don't know whether I've seen, well, I probably have. Summer Foundation have a service they offer around matching of tenants, which is quite resource intensive as it needs to be. I mean, this is one of the problems with group homes. Every time you add another person, you double the number of relationships in any sort of setting. So it's simpler to put one person into with one other person. It's much simpler than trying to put 5 people together. So we have seen these matching services develop as I said, Summer is doing it. They look resource intensive, they look expensive, but in the scheme of things, they're probably not. I think we will see a body of practice emerge around this space. Yes.
Last question. If a participant has SIL in their plans, do they automatically qualify for some sort of SDA?
My answer to that is yes, I think. As I understand it, everybody that gets SIL gets it. Sorry. No, say that again. I've got it the wrong way around.
If a participant has SIL in their plan, do they automatically qualify for some sort of SDA?
No. The answer is no. Many more people will have SIL than SDA. It's the reverse is true. If you've got SDA in your plan, you will have SIL, but if you have SIL, you will not necessarily have SDA. And this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the emergence of these SIL houses. And that number seems to be growing. We seem to have more and more people, proportionally more people having SIL only without SDA as time goes by. Okay, thanks very much. All right, moving on. I was talking before about the requirement to have a management agreement. And I suppose one of the things that began to struck me was that this is a diagram we used to use, that I've used in the past, just in terms of management, that relationship between the participant, the support provider and the housing provider. And I just want to make this point that this is evolving, but we now have a number of documents and requirements. So where you have a service provided under the NDIS, there's a service agreement. So in this case, what we have is the NDIS participant at the SDA recipient or the NDIS participant at the top, and they will have a service agreement for their SDA and a service agreement for their SIL. So I made a mistake on that. There should be a SIL service agreement on the right, and but they also, in terms of their tenancy, may in fact have another agreement that governs their tenancy relationship. In Victoria, we had this thing called the residential statement, which was a creature of the Disability Act, which has currently been unpicked. But it shows that you have a service agreement, you have a tenancy agreement for your housing, but you also have a service agreement for your support. You may also have some sort of collaboration agreement between the SDA provider and SIL provider. And rather than going into details, what I'm illustrating is there's a bunch of interrelated agreements here which are complex. I expect people will get these worked out and they'll be robust and there'll be a common set of them, but I'm not yet seeing them, and it would be easy to trip up. They've all got to be consistent, they've got to be consistent with state legislation, and they've got to be consistent with just the requirements of the NDIS. So if you, once again, if you come across people who's working in this space, this is an argument in some ways for moving with existing providers, because they will have gone through a lot of this development work, I would have thought. There is a requirement around what's in the service agreements. Now, this is imposed by the agency, and it talks about things like minimum periods, about rent and everything else. But what you've got to understand is there's the agency requirement at a Commonwealth funding level, if you like, but at each state has got its own legislation. So we've got Victoria going through amendments and adaptations of its own Residential Tenancy Act at the minute, which are also complex. So this is just understanding what that agreement between the NDIS participant and the actual landlord is becoming clearer, but it is complex. So you've got to meet those requirements of the agency, and then you've got to meet the state requirements, what they are. My observation about this is the leading work appears to be being done in Victoria on tenancy legislation, and I would expect that broadly to be replicated across the other states. So my advice would be to watch Victoria and see where we trip up in this space, because that will give you an indication of what will happen in the other states. It's just a complex area, and it's getting into management, but it becomes important down the track. And this is what I was talking about. The difference is in Victoria we have developed two different streams, one about a residential tenancy agreement, one around SDA residency agreement, both sitting under the Residential Tenancy Act. I won't go into any detail because it's quite technical, but if you are dealing with a housing manager, you really need them to have a very sophisticated view of how this works, what is possible and what is not. This is a complicated and evolving space. So just keep an eye. Don't assume that you can just go with existing agreements, either of the generic tenancy type or of the previous disability type. It's worth thinking about initiatives going on around the country. The first one, of course, is around the state government transfer. I mentioned that that a couple of times the difference, the state and stock held in New South Wales and Victoria. But what becomes really critical, I think, is just understanding the scale and what's going on. So these are very big portfolios, slightly different approaches being adopted in different states. So in Victoria, the SDA provision is held within the state government. It becomes a function essentially of public housing. In New South Wales, the housing management is put out, but the SDA provision is held within the state. So I think these are interim steps. At some point, something will happen to this stock. I think it will either be redeveloped or sold, or something will happen. And it is so big, it will impact on the whole broad market. In Victoria, it probably constitutes 30 or 40% of the supply. So it's just worth keeping an eye on it. It also is interesting to see how they're partnering up and who the players are emerging in this space. So the big providers are there. On the support side, there's not much about the housing side. That doesn't get a lot of debate, but there's often housing providers in New South Wales. In Victoria it's not, but in New South Wales. And one of them, of course, is Compass, who's got a lot of this stock. It's got about 900 places, I think, of SDA as we speak. So Compass Housing Services out of Newcastle. So we're beginning to see new players coming in, and what the thing about that is important is that they will be developing a set of practice outside of government, which is useful for those of us that don't work within government. In terms of the NDIS itself, it's been through a bumpy road in the SDA, whether it's the issues around just trying to get the scale up, and there was some limited success with a market update maybe about 18 months ago, which really brought it to a head, which really set a whole set of initiatives underway. Now they have been articulated, we begin to see them roll out. I don't think we've really seen fully how that will actually work out in the detail, but the ones that I think are important are the SDA reference group, of course, which brings together a lot of the key players. It had a limited life, but I expect that it will be extended. I think it's very valuable for someone like an agency with limited internal expertise to actually be able to go out and engage with the industry. We've seen some updates to the rules around bedroom use change and how things are mixed, so we're seeing some minor changes. We have seen some changes to the way SDA has been approved and the creation of this SDA panel within getting it approved within people's plans. The feedback I've received is that it's happening very quickly once it gets into the panel, but getting to the panel is still very, very slow. So we're still not seeing that shortened process we hope to get to over time. And this was what you would expect as you begin to enrol all these people, as you imagine. You'll have this hump and then we'll get through the hump. So the process is getting better. At least they're realising that SDA is a specialist area and that the planners won't actually have necessarily the understanding of SDA or indeed housing. The other one was the design standards that Bruce is going to cover off. There's an incredibly boring paper written around limited cost assumptions review. So if any of those accountants out there that want to read it, I'm an accountant and I found it boring, but it sort of goes back to the assumptions around the funding model and some of the debates. You can begin to see where people are positioning themselves. Probably the most interesting thing is the innovation plan, which I really haven't seen impact yet, but a commitment from the agency to do a number of things. One is to get better information around participants and put that out there, and that makes perfect sense. This is about informing the market so we know what sort of SDA people are actually entitled to out there and want out there. The other one is about engaging with stakeholders more and participants more and showcasing different models. So there is this sense that we're moving to a new age, a new style of SDA, but in fact the new models are not well understood. So the risk is people will simply build the old model, which may not be the best model, or they will build new models that are actually not very good. These are the risks that we're beginning to deal with in this process. And they're also engaging with external bodies, and this is specifically around Indigenous housing in the Northern Territory, and they are engaging with a body up there that builds affordable housing in remote areas. Now this makes perfect sense. It's so complex building this sort of stuff, of course you would partner with people who are already doing it. It does, however, represent a move away from the NDIS's hands-off approach to the market. It's beginning to realise that the SDA is not operating as a fully mature market, nor will it ever, because of its complexity and limitations and just how small we segment it down to. And they're also beginning to develop and produce much better data, which I've been mining today, which gives you a sense of what's happening, like that comparison between the number of bedrooms that we're coming through, what we expect in that space. So all of these things are committed to, they're resourced and they're underway. I expect they will flow out over the next 12 to 18 months. There is also a special initiative around young people in residential aged care. Now, not everybody in residential aged care will leave residential aged care. Not everybody leaving residential aged care will go into SDA, but a significant number will. And this is a political battle that's been going for essentially decades now, but led by Summer Foundation for a lot of that time. And so there is a commitment to actually have a very specific initiative about getting people out. So what you'll see is that pipeline coming into SDA, I think, in quite a direct way, which will be good. But it also means that it will showcase where other cohorts, I mean, for example, those people living at home with ageing carers, for example, will not be getting in the same way. So I think the residential aged care component will be the trailblazers coming into the SDA space, and they will create a lot of the rules and the ways we do things. I think it's always critical to look at who the key players are. So I look at the SDA reference group and I go down that and see who's on that. And that's a mixture of providers and advocates and peak bodies and everywhere else. SDA is a relatively small space. There's, ultimately we will only have 28,000 places, and if we have average of 3, that's 9 or 10,000 dwellings around the country. This is not huge numbers, and so what happens is you can actually get to identify who the key players, and that is particularly true once you move into a state or a particular part of a state. So if you're in Bendigo or Mildura, there's not going to be 50 providers there, there's going to be 5 or 6 who will know each other. So it's worth thinking about who the big players are, because we're seeing big players now moving out of their traditional patches into newer spaces. So I look at the SDA reference group, I look at the advocates, Summer Foundation, great resource, and they're often leading in development and have a very close relationship with the agency. In terms of managers, Compass Housing out of Newcastle, very big player. 2 years ago, I think they had the equivalent of 10 people in SDA, and now they've got 900. Just remarkable. I've done work for them. The federating bodies, so we've got a couple of federating bodies that are interesting. In the community housing space, there is in fact 2 federating bodies, bizarrely. There's Power Housing for the bigger players, and then what's called CHEER for everyone. Power Housing is particularly interested because the big players are in this space and they have a connection into some of the design spaces. So Power Housing is worth looking at. There's also a group called the SDA Alliance out of New South Wales, but covering more broadly, picking up a whole lot of different providers. So I look at what they're doing. Developers, Summer Housing. Guardian Living was a developer that has now got a partnership with one of the friendly societies. So they were early adopters and they're always interesting in what they're doing. We've got the monies coming through infrastructure groups. Now this is money essentially coming out of, from what I can see, out of ethical parts of super funds, but coming through these fund managers. Lighthouse and Macquarie are the 2 big ones. Macquarie's aligned with Summer, Lighthouse is aligned with others like Compass. And the lenders, I mentioned before, the 2 lenders that I've seen active in this space are community sector banking, part of Bendigo Bank and Bank Australia. And as I keep saying, for every $1 spent in SDA, there's 10 spent in SIL. So the question is, who are the SIL providers? So what I've done is just list for you some of the big SIL providers that I see around the country. So I'm interested in what they're doing. This is not an exhaustive list, and this is the big ones. There's a couple of innovative ones, but this is really interesting in a market, whether the big players will dominate the shaping of the market or whether the new ones, innovative ones, will come through. I suspect that the innovative ones will begin to shift the market, but the what we're happening now with the coronavirus will cause an economic and shock that will actually dampen the effect of the new players. So we shall see. But you know, if I was working in an area, I'd be looking to engage with one of these players if they were operating in my space. They're the people who would understand the space really well. In terms of the people, they won't understand SDA particularly well, or they'll have a very narrow view of it, but they will understand the people, and they will understand the NDIS, which is important. I wanted to talk about SDA projects because there's a lot of fluff that floats around. You know, this wonderful new project, the minister there is cutting it, cutting the ribbon, but I always struggle to try and figure out exactly what it is that they've got. You know, is it a 5-bedroom house? Is it one house with 3 units in it? What level of complexity? So what I thought I would simply do is say, there's a couple of things around developers. I want to know why somebody's developing this house. Are they developing it simply to make a profit? Are they going to, pump it up and sell it on the market and be out of there in 6 or 12 months or whatever it takes to build? Are they there to hold it for the long-term profit? Is it part of their mission? Are they a church or a not-for-profit who sees this as an area of need? Are they trying to do it to create a presence in a marketplace? By creating a group house, they can actually make a real presence in a smaller, particularly regional community. So it could be marketing, or they might be thinking as a support provider, if they can encourage or somehow facilitate this project, they can gain efficiencies just by reducing the travel time of their staff. So the first thing is, why is somebody doing a development? And the second question is, what does this development look like? So I've essentially created a checklist which is in this, this pack, and broadly around 5 different areas. The first one is, what is it used for? Because we've gone past the days where we'll only have housing development. People will only live in group houses and that's all it is on the site. Now we're moving into properties that may be residential, or they might be offices, or might have retail in the building. So what's the use of the site? How many people in there? What sort of supports they require? How accessible is it? What level of design is in place? Who the development was, how they funded it, because if one developer is working in a number of spaces, I'm interested in that, because they will impact on it. And finally, how is it managed? What sort of tenure do they have? Are they covered under which part of the Act, or what sort of thing, who the manager is? Is it the SDA provider? Is it a community housing provider that's been brought in? Is it the local real estate agent? I mean, these things are interesting. These things differentiate different projects. And what we'll see over time is there will be a narrowing of the number of options. So people will fall to going back to a similar option at different times. Let me demonstrate this to you. And this is the project which I call the mother or the father of SDA. I don't know whether it is SDA or not, but this is a development in Abbotsford, Gibb Street. So let's work through the checklist and you can see exactly what I mean. So what's the use of this building? This building is entirely residential. Who does it house? It houses a mixture of private housing, social housing and disability, housing for people with disabilities. So it has those 3 different components. How big is it? It's 59 units of 1 and 2 bedroom stock. It has 6 disability units, 25 cooperative units and 28 private dwellings. The history of this project is it's developed by a group called Common Equity, which is one of the biggest social housing providers in Australia, but they house people in cooperatives, and they found that a lot of their people were getting older. They needed to consolidate their property in the inner city, so they built smaller housing on this site. Now, instead of just building housing for SDA, they mixed it up, funded it essentially by selling some of it off privately. As that was happening, Summer and others, I think the Transport Action Commission put money into it as well, got involved and thought there was a great opportunity to pilot these individual units for people with high physical need but shared support across the building. So what you see is a developer mixing up this quite large building, but a really interesting model. And so, as I said, 59 units on site, 6 units of what would be today SDA. It's modified for high physical. What level of LHA, don't know. SDA level, probably high physical, but because it was built before, it probably wouldn't meet all of the new standards. Who was the developer? I talked about that. That's Common Equity. The units were purchased by Summer and the TAC. Who are the owners? Well, the owners are the private owners. There's Common Equity owns some for the social housing, Summer owns some, and Ripple. Ripple is a trust owned by the Transport Accident Commission in Victoria. What's the tenure? I think it's a social housing lease. So it's a more traditional lease. It's not under the Disability Act of Victoria, but it's like every other lease in social housing. And at this stage, it was managed by a private agent, which is sort of interesting. I had expected to be managed by a community housing provider, and maybe I've got that wrong. So, but what I've done is that very clearly gives me an understanding of what's happening in that project, who the players are and what the key components. If I contrast this with another project, this is an SDA project done by Tom Kara's group, so Kara Properties. So this is much simpler. So this is a residential setting. It's fully residential. It's only for NDIS participants, 6 by 2 bedroom houses. It's all disability stock. Are there any spare staff? I'm assuming there is, but I'm not sure. It's not identified, so I don't have all the information. There will be overnight support there. How many providers? Not identified. I would assume 1, but I don't know. Once again, you don't know, but this allows you to sort of ask the questions when you're talking to people about a project. Was it designed for people with improved livability? What LHA? Don't know, and that's probably fallen away now with the design rules. We probably don't need to know. But in terms of the NDIS standards, it's improved livability. Who's the developer? Kara Properties. How much does it cost? Don't know, because it's privately funded. You wouldn't know. Where did the money come from? Don't know. Who's the owners? Kara's are going to be the owners. They're going to hold it long term, which is interesting. They're not flipping it. They're covered under the Victorian Residential Tenancy Act. I'm not quite sure under which provision. Who manages it? Not sure, but there's a reference to somewhere on it and a photo. So what you begin to see is when you have this worksheet and you're talking about existing projects or thinking about your own projects, these are the sort of conversations you can have. And I've used this worksheet in community meetings where I've sat down with a whole bunch of people who might be interested in housing and get them to work together to think about what sort of property they want. It's a great way to sort of channel the debate. If you talk about housing, you can sort of get lost by going down these different alleys. This is a way for people to marshal all their thoughts in different places. Finally, how are we doing? Oh, we're still running early. I suppose now I'm coming to the end of my part of the presentation and we'll move on to Q&A. But I just wanted to go back and think about, I know I've covered an enormous amount, but I wanted to distill it down to probably 10 points, if you like. The first one is around expertise. This is about the introductions that we didn't have or we can't have. But I got to say that every time I present, there is more expertise in the room than actually at the front of the room. And it's because this is a fluid area. Things are changing, everything is changing. So the first thing you have to do, I think, is acknowledge that that you listen to everybody in the room and think about where they bring it together. And the hardest thing is try and put their knowledge into this SDA frame. So the first thing is knowledge from all, not just the experts. If somebody presents as an expert in this space, be very cautious, let me assure you. The NDIS, large, more complex than anything we've ever seen, probably. Now that the coronavirus is here, I'm probably not sure that's true. But anyway, up until the coronavirus, this was the most complicated thing I'd ever seen. And it is changing, it is evolving. So if you feel a bit lost by it all, or it doesn't make sense, or something you heard last month has changed, that's okay, that's how it is. It is settling down over time, and particularly SDA is now settling down, but it's been a pretty wild ride. Coronavirus, significant, but we're not clear what the impact is. And I'm talking about impact on public policy and on funding arrangements. Not so much about the health. Housing for SDA, of course, there's 90,000 people out there looking for housing, some of them looking for SDA, but there's a whole bunch of housing stuff happening outside of SDA. SDA itself, 28,000 places for the highest need paid commercially and recurrently, and of that, pathway to the money. To get to the SDA money, you need the right SDA and SIL in the plan. You need it in enrolled dwelling managed by a registered provider. So thinking about those hurdles, how you get past those hurdles. In terms of SDA growth, the current supply is 17,000, but we're growing to 28, but that 17,000 might be redeveloped. It is different in every state, and I'd probably say it is different in every sub-market and market and community. SDA management. Service and tenancy agreements exist, but they now need to comply with state laws, and those state laws are evolving. So that part of the machinery is moving. There are some initiatives in SDA in government. So there's the things that the SDA is doing in terms of, the NDIS is doing around SDA, improving how that's rolling out. But there's also other things going on in terms of the state government stocks. So the New South Wales Victorian state government stock, watch them very closely, because I think that when they begin to move, that's when the world changes. Players and resources. There's a number of players out there, government, non-government, private, worth following. My observation is that while the numbers are small, they don't all know each other, and if they do know each other, don't share common knowledge and common language. So it is very valuable to bring people together and have broad-ranging open discussions. I mean, it might be at some point you enter into commercial arrangements or competitive arrangements, but in most cases I don't think we're actually there. So start these bigger conversations. And in fact, the sessions that Bruce and I have done in WA and in Darwin, one of the most valuable things was the conversations that happened in the morning and afternoon tea that we weren't part of, because you saw those relationships begin to form. SDA, the framework, and just remember that you can use that framework when people are talking about projects or thinking about projects, just begin to jot down notes in that framework, and just they're the questions you need to ask when people talk about the new latest SDA framework. So that's where I'm up to. Now, I'm happy now to, you've got my contact details there, my company's name, email is josephconlon@gmail.com, and you've got my mobile, 0438 388 444. Now we're going to move to a couple of questions. Bruce.
If I am an individual investor who is interested in acquiring a small portfolio of SDA homes, how do I go about finding a provider that can source and manage the tenants?
Okay, so you're an investor, you've bought your SDA homes. Well, I would be very cautious about buying stock without having a pipeline through to tenants, to SDA recipients, but assuming that comes, assuming there's a pool, I would be looking at, there's two parts to that. Who's going to be the SDA provider and who's going to manage the property? I would probably bundle those together and look at who the biggest providers operating in my space are. Now that's just beginning to emerge, but I would look at people like Compass Housing or the community housing providers. It may be possible the local real estate agent could do it, but this is a complicated space and they wouldn't be able to do the SDA compliance part of it. So you've got to do the two together.
Considering the current situation with COVID-19 and SIL providers, would it be considered inconsiderate to be approaching SIL provider managers to discuss planning SDA projects in collaboration?
No, if it's measured. I think it is incredibly disruptive, what we're going through at the minute. And, in some ways I've been reflecting on that question just by having this seminar today. I mean, it's just the right time. And I think the thing about housing is that it's long and it's slow and it doesn't need to be confrontational. We're building through a process. So I think if you can put ideas and opportunities before people, but expect in the vast majority of cases they simply won't have the bandwidth to deal with it, I think that's all right. I also, part of me thinks that there might be an opportunity to speed the development of SDA as part of the economic recovery after this. That's a very embryonic thought. But I think the answer is, I think, yeah, it's okay, but you just accept that lots of people will just be too busy.
Final question. Can I invest into an SDA without being a registered service provider? i.e., can I build a property and register it as a dwelling?
Say that again, as?
Can I invest into an SDA without being a registered service provider? i.e., can I build a property and register it as a dwelling?
Yes, you can, because you don't need to be, there does need to be an SDA service provider. Sorry, I'll have to take that on. I'm just telling you, do you have to be a registered provider to enrol a dwelling, might be the question. Oh, look, we'll take that on notice. I'm not sure about that. I certainly know you can be an owner and not be registered, that's fine. But how the enrolment happens, it might be that you need to get the SDA provider to enrol the property. I think that's the answer. So the answer is yes, you can invest without doing the other part, but you need that partnership with the SDA provider. So on that note, I might thank you very much for your participation. Apologies about the complexity. We are navigating a new world, and I'm very grateful for you to be here, to be working on something which is long term when we're all focused a bit on the short term. And just to reiterate, after lunch, Bruce will be dealing with the more technical part. And also, if you have any queries or questions, I'm always happy for a chat. Bruce, do you want to say something before we head off to lunch?
It's 11:20 now, so we might look at starting back up right on 12 o'clock. If people have problems at 12 o'clock and their browser's got issues, just do a refresh and you should be right. Thank you.
Welcome to the Maddie Mac ND solution, where independence is delivered to specialist disability accommodation like never seen before. Maddie Mac's passion is creating independence through innovative and robust technology, while providing simplicity in operation. SDA can be complex and difficult to navigate, but with Maddie Mac's experience and collaboration with leading national housing providers, the solution and process is clear. With Indy, users instantly receive the benefits of a purpose-built SDA platform, providing a clear, low-touch, intuitive experience. And with the integration of a hospital-grade, state-of-the-art assistive call system built into an all-in-one platform, it creates an easy-to-learn and effective approach when help is needed. With functional options including duress pendants and optional alert systems and notification escalation, safety is always paramount. The Indy solution works seamlessly with Google, enabling endless options. Indy integration voice control is just another feature to create the ultimate experience in assistive technology. Flexibility is key. Using Google's base means no lock-in ecosystem, completely customizable and truly future-ready, so all Google-enabled devices, whether now or in the future, can be integrated. Maddie Mac do not take safety lightly, utilising a 10-point safety check on each and every project to identify critical items like UPS and FIP integration, notification escalation processes, tenancy smart smoke alarm lockouts, and deploying an enterprise-grade Wi-Fi network. A clear system design is key to delivering beneficial, compliant outcomes, which is why Maddie Mac prides themselves on client tender support, contractor coordination and documentation. The streamlined Indy solution trims away unnecessary frills, leaving an adaptive, modular-based system to allow the use of on-site subcontractors for further site efficiencies. Maddie Mac's design, deliver and support team are on hand throughout the whole journey, from fit-off, testing and commissioning, through to all handover O&M documentation, delivered on time and budget, all in a challenging SDA space. When it comes to assistive technology, a project is only ever as good as its support, which is why Maddie Mac has a designated Indy support team to deliver their assurance program, including 3 years hardware and software assurance, Wi-Fi network system monitoring, and a detailed maintenance program. Training and participant support is the critical link to ensuring smooth operation and participant benefits. Maddie Mac takes the time to work with SIL providers and occupational therapists through detailed training and documentation, while understanding the participants' available options. See why leading providers insist on Maddie Mac. Speak with our design team about your next SDA project.